Chapter 226. Looking at that figure, Su Lu thought of the conflict in Linyuan that night. This young lieutenant colonel's terrifying combat strength, and even more so, he thought of the other party's grandfather, the military god worshipped by the federal military as a god, the old man the uncle spoke of. He also thought of what Secretary Jiao said in Cloud Queen Hotel earlier, that he might become the Federation's youngest field officer after the new year. However, not far in front of him, Mad Manly, who didn't take human life seriously, was the one who held the record for being the youngest field officer in the Federation. Moreover, from the looks of it, this record would probably be very difficult to break. The 16-year-old madman Li liked the daughter of Deputy Minister Zhou of the Department of National Defense. This wasn't a secret in the upper circles of the capital. Even though most people carried a trace of interest in their eyes and used cute and kissable words to describe the actions of the only child of the Lees of Philadelphia, no one really took this seriously. However, Su Lu, who had endured Madman Li's terrifying power in Linyuan, knew that this young lieutenant colonel really did have these thoughts. With this as a prior reason, Madman Li came to the hospital to visit Zhou Yu, who had just given birth. Even though there was still a bit of an awkward feeling, it was still acceptable. Tai Ziyuan is a sick ghost. If you like him, then you really are blind. There's no way you like Su Lu, a guy who's as thin as a stick of firewood. Madman Li sat in front of Zhou Yu's bed very seriously and said, "Also, the two of you still haven't held a wedding. I've always felt that this matter is a bit strange. Regardless of whether it's you looking down on him or if he's going to abandon his wife and child, in short, I think you can marry me." This person clearly knew that Su Lu had already entered the room, but it was as if he didn't exist at all and continued to speak his own words. The lieutenant colonel epaulettes, tender face, tall and sturdy body, plus the insufferably arrogant tone in his voice, mixed together to create such a little monster. Su Lu walked to the side of the bed and sat beside Zhou Yu. He gently patted Lu Hua's soft head and then took a green fruit and began to peel it seriously. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, "Do I just chew it like this or cut it into pieces and eat it?" Zhou Yu glared at him and thought to himself, "Why does this fellow have to create such an atmosphere at such a time? Isn't he deliberately trying to provoke this easily angered little thing?" Su Lu did it on purpose. After the trip to Harbor City, his mentality had greatly changed compared to before. When facing a direct person, he had to use direct method. Madman Li showed contempt as if he didn't exist, so he naturally had a way to retaliate. Although this kind of pique seemed a bit childish, Madman Li was still a young man, and Su Lu did indeed have a pure heart. Madman Li looked at the green fruit in Su Li's hand. There was a hint of anger gradually accumulating in his young features. It seeped out from his body, which was about to break out of his military uniform, and directly pressured Su Li's senses. The fruit knife in Su Li's hand paused slightly. Both of them were not easy to get along with, so they could both feel the strange and slightly dry feeling in the room. At this time, this atmosphere seemed to affect the little thing in Zhou Yu's arms. The newborn closed his eyes tightly, grimaced in pain, and cried out. As soon as the cry came out, Madman Li suddenly became a little nervous. Previously, when he was talking with Zhou Yu in the ward, in order not to wake up the baby, he tried his best to suppress the sound that was enough to shatter the glass. He didn't expect that the baby would be woken up after all. "3 days ago, when I heard the news that you gave birth, Grandpa let me out. I have to go back to Philadelphia tonight." Madman Li stood up and put on his military cap. His hands steadily moved forward along the brim of the cap. He straightened his military posture and said in a deep voice, "Take care of yourself. If there is any problem, call me." Su Lu walked him to the door. The military officer outside the door saw that the two of them didn't fight like the previous time and heaved a sigh of relief. He stood at attention and saluted. He said, reporting, "The helicopter is ready. It is ready to take off." Madman Li stared fiercely at that subordinate and scolded angrily, "Lower your voice. What a bastard! Don't you know that a child needs to sleep? Su glanced at him and thought to herself, your voice seems to be louder. Previously in the ward, he had already realized that although Mad Manly was crazy, easily angered, and ruthless, he was really good to Zhou. He even showed that he cared a lot about little Lu Hua. At this thought, he had a better impression of this successor of the Lees of Philadelphia. However, at this moment, Mad Manly turned around and looked at him coldly. He put his hands behind his back and said, I said before that I will beat you to death. Su Lu looked at Mad Manly's clear eyes that had a trace of madness. He smiled and said, I haven't heard it before. Mad Manly was tall and sturdy. At the age of 16, he was already half a head taller than Su Lu. He looked down at Su Li's hateful face and said word by word, At this time, you heard it. Su Lu looked at him quietly. After a while, he suddenly asked, Does your throat still hurt? Mad Manly narrowed his eyes, as if he would attack Su Lu at any time in this quiet corridor. That night in Linyuan, he knew that this seemingly inconspicuous civilian second lieutenant had close combat skills that could match him. However, with his iron-blooded aura that had been nurtured on the battlefield for many years and his personality that killed without blinking, Mad Manly did not know how to write the word retreat. He even thought that night in Linyuan, it was because he had underestimated his opponent too much. However, that night, Su Lu had been shocked until his gums bled from the 3 attacks, while Mad Manly had vomited blood as if his chest had been cut by a knife. He was an invincible figure in the army, but he had still lost. Su Li's question pointed directly at Mad Manly's vital point. Mad Manly was silent for a moment before he turned and left. This little brat wants to imitate a famous general with his hands behind his back. He clearly doesn't use his brain to do things, but he pretends to be a scheming and astute person. Su Lu accurately divided the green fruit into a dozen pieces and put them in a bowl. He took out a tissue to wipe his hands and shook his head. If Li Feng is really a youth with extraordinary talent in combat, do you think he can live so well on the front lines all these years? Zhou looked at him with a trace of melancholy. Su Lu thought so and threw the tissue into the trash can beside him. He raised his thick eyebrows and said with a smile, After all, he is only 16 years old. He can make such a big name. On one hand, it is because of his family. On the other hand, it is because this youth's strength is really too terrifying. It is strange that a 16-year-old guy dares to call himself invincible in the army. He is really a freak. Compared to Mad Manly, I think you are more of a freak. Zhou said calmly, You are only 4 years older than him, but you are already a bit like an old man. When it comes to fighting, you can actually stand up to him as an equal. Now, even my old man wants to use your head to make that new mecha. Am I very old? Su Lu asked in surprise. Li Xiaotong also said so. I thought that my temperament had already become as open-minded as before. Zhou glared at him in annoyance. After a moment, she said seriously, I heard the conversation outside the ward earlier. Why did you go against him? This is very unlike you. Besides, the other party is someone from the Lees of Philadelphia. As long as that old man is still around, the entire Federation has to give his family some face. Would he really dare to kill me in broad daylight? Mad Manly. Once he goes crazy, what doesn't he dare to do? Zhou lowered her eyes slightly and said, Don't blame him for being violent. Anyone who was thrown into the army when they were just 12 years old and stayed on the front lines for a few years will also become a little strange. You should know that Li Feng being able to become the youngest major in the Federation has nothing to do with the war god. That was truly done by him piloting the M52 mecha and fighting against the Empire's special forces. Zhou glanced at Su Lu and said worriedly, Mad Manly has been on the front lines for 3.5 years. He single-handedly killed 27 level 1 pilots from the Empire's Royal Special Forces. This kind of person is used to blood. You shouldn't provoke him. Su Lu listened to the young lieutenant colonel's battle record and couldn't help but frown and sigh. He had also started killing when he was 10 years old. After escaping to the capital ring, he had also killed several people. However, Madman Li had killed pilots from the Empire's Royal Special Forces on the battlefield. These two battle records were on a completely different level. Su Lu took out a double-headed silver fruit stick and placed it in a bowl. He handed it to Zhou Yu and said, "If there comes a day when he really wants to kill me, I won't let him do it just like that." Zhou Yu looked at him carefully holding the bowl and her heart softened. She warned him seriously, "The problem is that he has a gun." Su Lu smiled and thought of the first time he met this girl beside him. He said mockingly, "That's right. As a son of the military, he can do whatever he wants in the Federation if he has a gun. Without a gun, he can't do anything." Zhou Yu understood the hidden meaning in his words. She snorted and didn't say anything else. She changed the topic and said, "Since father is so anxious to see you, it seems that the matters at the engineering department are really urgent. You shouldn't stay in the hospital all the time." Although the summer sun outside the window was scorching, it had become much gentler after being filtered by the light-absorbing membrane. Little Lu Hua, who had just finished his vaccination, was immersed in a sweet dream. He didn't care about the light spots that were floating around like fireflies. Of course, the little guy had just learned how to open his eyes as a form of entertainment. Before he slept, he even showed Zhou Yu and Su Lu that he was turning a blind eye. Instead, it was Su Lu who was disturbed by the light spots. He lowered his head to look at the sleeping baby and said softly, "Then I'll go back first." Zhou Yu nodded lightly. Previously, she had already heard all the details of Su Li's trip to Harbor City from him. While she was shocked by the structure of this guy's brain, she also knew that the current situation was coincidentally at a crucial point. "Don't underestimate me." Zhou Yu lifted her chin slightly and said, "And don't look at me with your nice guy mindset. But we have to think of a solution for this." Su Lu scratched his head and looked at the child beside her. He thought of the auntie he saw this morning and Zhou Yu last night. "You are really very boring, do you know that?" Zhou Yu said, "Since you have already given birth, what are you worried about? If someone asks, just say that we will talk about it when the child is older. Don't you know how to delay things?" Chapter 227. Su Li's temperament was straightforward, refreshing, and pleasant. Although he had become somewhat taciturn in the past 6 months due to the death of a certain girl, after the trip to Hong Kong, he had gradually shaken off those gray emotions. His smile was gradually as cheerful as before, and his speech was gradually as amiable and pleasant as when he was young. Therefore, it was really difficult for him to delay this matter. However, he was also clear that in the eyes of everyone, he was Zhou Yu's biological father. However, this was not the truth. Zhou Yu was a young mother who wrapped her sensitivity, pride, and self-pity with indifference. She would definitely not accept a fake marriage to quell all the discussions. Therefore, this matter could only be delayed. How long would it be delayed? Perhaps it would be delayed until Shi Qinghai came back and was no longer a fugitive from the Federation? This was a very difficult situation. Su Lu had no other choice but to wait. He did not tell Zhou Yu that Shi Qinghai had contacted him last night, because it was meaningless. He only hoped that what Shi Qinghai was doing now, and what he was going to do, would be able to suppress Senator Macklin and the forces around him. He would be able to reveal the truth, and give Shi Qinghai a chance to be reborn. On the way out of the Army General Hospital, he met Li Xiaotong, who was holding a large bouquet of star flowers. Perhaps it was because old 7th of the Li family was coming to the General Hospital, so he was wearing a military uniform. It was very different from his usual attire. The well-ironed military uniform matched with this person's slightly cold aura, which made people feel that he was somewhat handsome. Li Xiaotong was not surprised to see Su Lu here. He said with a smile, "I'm here to see Zhou Yu. You won't object, right?" Su Lu looked at the military uniform on Li Xiaodong and shook his head with a smile. These days, Su Lu and Li Xiaodong had a lot of contact. Although the two people's status was very different, their temperaments were somewhat similar. Although Li Xiaodong had never expressed his interest in Zhou Yu during the banquets in the nightclubs, Su Lu knew this in advance, so he didn't feel strange when he saw Li Xiaodong's arrival. He just thought that if Li Xiaodong had met Madman Li earlier, the scene would have been very interesting. Li Xiaodong explained, "I have a position in the 1st Military Region, so of course I don't have to wear a military uniform." Seeing that Su Lu seemed to have the intention to leave, he was a little confused, but he suppressed this feeling and asked seriously, "When are you going to hold the wedding? This is a serious matter." Su Lu thought of the stalling technique taught by Zhou Yu. He awkwardly scratched his head and said, "She's not in the mood right now. Some things could be delayed, but some things could not be delayed." After leaving the Army General Hospital, Su Lu didn't go back to his apartment, but went directly to the Whitewater Company base in the suburbs of the capital. Today was the first working day after the end of the holiday, but the buildings on the ground of the Whitewater Company base were still deserted. After working in this security company for so many days, Su Lu was naturally not surprised when he first came here. He knew that the company's combat personnel and equipment were basically hidden underground. He hurriedly walked into his office and saw the heavy black leather case under the table. He relaxed a little and said to Bai Yulan, who was resting on the sofa next to him, "Thank you for your hard work. After I left last night, did anything happen?" Bai Yulan gently shook her head, pursed her dry lips, and walked out. He didn't ask why Su Lu was in such a hurry to return to the capital last night. As a subordinate, he was only responsible for bringing back the leather case that the other party valued very much. After closing the office door, Su Lu pressed his thumb on the flat glass lock of the black leather case. The fingerprint scan passed, and the black leather case's lock spring automatically popped open. Li Xiaodong invested 40 million in one go. Although the Li family controlled a lot of wealth, as a second-generation child who didn't officially take over the family business, Li Laoqi's investment was very bold. Su Lu received 40 million. Except for the 20 million he gave to Bai Yulan, the rest of the money was used to buy the precision materials he needed in the Federation's black market. When he was in the Donglin district, he came into contact with this business. Later, when he was in Yue University, he bought several times, so he was familiar with this business. Except for the important modification, most of the 20 million was invested in the black leather case in front of him. Jaixian's newest workbench. After using Secretary Shin's workbench in Macho's back mountain, Su Lu fell in love with this collective comprehensive processing equipment. Although it was a bit cumbersome, as long as the user adjusted it, it could block all electronic monitoring and effectively prevent data leakage. Moreover, the processor was very powerful, completely enough to carry out complex calculations and composition. He turned off the phone's wireless signal and used a data cable to connect the phone to the workbench. Once the download was completed, he immediately destroyed the email attachment in the phone. The attachment was opened on the workbench's holographic screen. The first picture was of a middle-aged man wearing a synthetic sweater in a park, talking to a blonde woman. There was still snow on the park bench, so the time of the photo should be winter. The following pictures were more or less the same content, but the participants of the conversation were no longer the two people from before. Under the picture was a table with some complicated data. He didn't know what it was for. Su Lu squinted his eyes and carefully compared it. In the end, he confirmed that it should be the flow of funds. The problem was, if this was the funds used by Senator Medellin's office to plan a secret operation, then it definitely wouldn't go through the Federation's financial system. How did Shi Qinghai get it? After quickly browsing through the table, Su Lu saw a few audio files in the document. He put on his headphones and pressed play. He tilted his head and listened carefully to the conversation that was obviously secretly recorded. His expression gradually became serious. In addition to the photos, audio files, and the direction of the flow of funds, there were a few confession documents. However, on those documents, there were no witnesses' signatures, only a few blood-red handprints. Sulu carefully looked through everything again, then leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes and began to think. He looked calm, but his slightly trembling hands behind his head revealed his true emotions at this time. The attachment that Shi Qinghai sent was actually these things. Although these materials seemed to be messy, under the clues of the confessions, one could clearly see that a story had happened. In the late autumn of the 66th year of the constitutional calendar, Senator Medellin's office issued an order to those hidden in the dark to begin searching for Tai Yuan's whereabouts. After the middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater received this information, he met with an officer in the apartment opposite the Department of National Defense. He used this information to lure the other party to launch an attack at the Linhai State Gymnasium. In the spring of the 67th year of the constitutional calendar, Senator Medellin's office issued another order. The middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater met with a businessman in Nank State. The businessman avoided the Federation's surveillance and took advantage of the temporary chaos in the Second Military Region in the spring to successfully obtain a large amount of explosive. He handed them to the executor of the plan and caused the terrorist attack on the Peace Concert Ring Mountain 4 State. The businessman left S2 before the attack and returned to Nank State very naturally. If this evidence could be used, then the deceiving Senator Medellin's reputation would be tarnished in front of tens of billions of people in the Federation. He would be directly arrested and sent to prison to face the law. Sulu opened his eyes and stared blankly at the holographic screen. His heart was filled with complex emotions. He secretly sighed in his heart. "Rascal, how did you do it?" However, the key problem with this evidence was that Senator Medellin's office did not leave any trace of the order. None of the recordings were related to this important link. The only thing that could explain some of the problems was the photo of the blonde woman in the synthetic sweater meeting with the middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater. The note clearly stated that the woman should be Senator Medellin's secretary, Helen. Suli's eyes narrowed. If he remembered correctly, this old-fashioned Miss Helen was one of the 7 staff members who unfortunately died in Senator Medellin's office in the news of the terrorist attack at the concert a few days ago. At present, it seemed that only those few photos could prove the relationship between Senator Medellin and these two crazy tragedies. However, these photos would not play much of a role in court. Moreover, Senator Medellin was now a candidate for the vice president. He had relevant judicial immunity before the election. If he wanted to persuade the Federation Management Committee to set up a special investigation team, it seemed to be a little too difficult. He looked at the confessions again and rubbed his slightly swollen temples. The excitement in his heart gradually subsided. Yes, this evidence was not enough to put Senator Medellin to death, but it was enough to tell a very beautiful and the most reasonable story. It was enough to make the voters of the Federation question Senator Medellin. And if the Federation government also accepted this evidence, with the powerful power of the government, it was impossible that they could not find some of the things that they really needed. He could imagine how much effort and how much risk young Master Shi had to take in order to obtain these extremely valuable materials. The middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater, who gave the confessions, and the businessman from Nankashou had probably died at the hands of Shi Qinghai. When dealing with such professionals, the trial of the Federation and the questioning of the inspection department would not be of much use. There was not much point in keeping them alive. Senator Medellin's office received the information about the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium from Zhang Xiaoming, and then passed it to an officer through the middle-aged man. Sulu narrowed his eyes. If this matter had to be brought to court, he could testify for the first part of the process, but what about the second part? In the notes deliberately left by Shi Qinghai, among the officers who committed suicide in the Second Military Region, there was no one who the middle-aged man was referring to. That officer seemed to be working for a certain senator, but there were so many senators in the Federation Management Committee, as well as state senators, so how could they find out who he was? Su Lu looked at the evidence on the screen, and a lot of complicated emotions grew in his heart. He seemed to be able to see with his own eyes that in order to find these things, Shi Qinghai had lurked in the dark like a cheetah, waiting for an opportunity, and then used ruthless methods to force out the long-awaited answers. At this time, Mr. Shi had probably disappeared into the night again. Was he waiting for the reaction of the Federation, or was he continuing to investigate that officer, or was he coldly looking at Senator Medellin's face, which was full of vicissitudes and a sense of justice, on the campaign poster? Su Lu believed it was the latter. He and Shi Qinghai were the same type of people at heart. He knew that if Senator Medellin could not get a fair trial, they would perhaps both act as the judge. A person's status affected the credibility of his words. Naturally, no one would believe the words of a fugitive from the Federation, so Shi Qinghai had given these things to Su Lu. Of course, before the MX Mecha appeared in front of the Federation citizens, Su Lu's words would not carry much weight. However, Shi Qinghai knew that Su Lu had some channels that he did not currently have. Su Lu closed the workstation, used his cell phone to make a call, and said, "Hello, I have some things here that you should be very interested in." Secretary Shen's eternally calm voice came from the other end of the line. "Do you want to meet me in person?" "Yes." Secretary Shen gave a location over the phone and arranged a time. Before hanging up, Su Lu said, "This is something that one of my brothers exchanged for with his life. I hope you can use it well." Walking out of the office, Bai Yulan was leaning against the wall with her head lowered, hands tucked in her hands, waiting for him in this seemingly unchanging posture. "I just received a call from the CEO's office. There's an old mecha that needs to be re-evaluated. This job has been handed over to us, Team 7. Bai Yulan lowered the tips of her toes and reported softly. Su Lu thought of the call just now, and his heart skipped a beat. He understood that this was probably a response to his request to the Tai family. However, he had not expected that the other party would actually be able to get a mecha for him in such a short amount of time. Leaving the building, they followed the automated passageway towards the underground storeroom. In front of Area C, Su Lu and Bai Yulan went through 3 layers of electronic surveillance before entering the heavily guarded core base. The heavy door opened, and a black mecha about 6 meters tall appeared in front of the two of them. This Federation military M37 mecha had a few inconspicuous cracks on its body. The metallic luster underneath the black material shone through these cracks, shining coldly, welcoming its new owner. Su Lu knew that this was the mecha that belonged to him. Although the model was a little old, and was quite a bit behind the standard M52 used by the Federation military, he still felt an urge that he had never felt before. He took a deep breath of the slightly dry air and said, "Inform the engineering department that we'll go over this weekend." Bai Yulan raised her head slightly and looked at him curiously. She said softly, "Not delaying any more?" "Not delaying any more." Su Lu thought of Deputy Minister Zhou's beating, thought of the evidence on the workbench, and looked at the M37 in front of him. He was in a good mood for the past 6 months. He said loudly, "I'm in a good mood, so I won't play with them anymore." Chapter 228. F***CK. I wrote the wrong chapter name again. 164s, so embarrassing. But I won't admit that I wasn't good at math since I was young. My mom was a math teacher in elementary school, and I got first place in a math competition in junior high. Of course, I think I flunked college math. I admit that I made a real mistake. Yesterday, I said that there was a bloody handprint on the confession made by Shi Qinghai. After thinking about it for a long time, I realized that the bloody handprint was too silly. If it was electronically scanned, what's the point? Admit my guilt. After admitting my guilt, I lowered my head and asked for vote. I'm not far from the top, only 100 or 2 votes away. Very impulsive, isn't it? I learned this chapter name for fun. See if it's fun. When Su Lu and Bai Yulan walked in front of the black M37 Mecha, the barred galaxy, 594 light-years away from them, the administrative planet of the Federation's region S3, which was close to the plateau but bordered the East Sea, was about to welcome the most dazzling rays of light at noon. Dressed in a black suit, Butler Jean hung up the phone and walked along the corridor made of wooden planks to the ancient-looking building halfway up the mountain. This was an ancient imperial-style temple. During the constitutional era, the Federation intentionally or unintentionally erased all traces of the imperial dynasty. Only a few old buildings in remote areas were preserved under the strong request of certain experts and scholars. This temple was probably used to worship the heavens tens of thousands of years ago. The glory of the old days had long disappeared into history. Only the light yellow cornices, dark round ancient pillars, and mottled walls reminded people of its age and dignity. The entire temple was built against the mountain, facing the sea in the east. It welcomed the first ray of light in the world and listened to the last sound of the pine trees at night. Unfortunately, behind the mountain was the plateau where S3 suddenly rose, so although the scenery was beautiful, very few people came. Every year, the Federation would provide funds for a major renovation of an ancient building that was listed on the list. However, it was not a tourist attraction, and the ownership of the building did not seem to be in the hands of the Federation. Therefore, the building was not well managed, and gradually, it was on the verge of decay. It seemed that if the pines behind the mountain or the waves in front of the mountain were a little more magnificent, this temple would turn into dust and disappear. The blazing noon sun shone on the glazed roof, reflecting an uncomfortable light. Butler Jean lowered his head and stood outside a small room at the side of the temple. He said softly to the woman who was busy in the room, "Shenli is going to meet Su Lu tonight. I heard that Su Lu has something important that might be related to Macklin." When the woman heard this, she did not have much of a reaction. Her head was still lowered as she chopped onions and garlic on the chopping board. The slender and sharp knife in her fair hands fell rapidly on the chopping board, producing a dry and annoying sound. Along with the sound, the onions and garlic turned into flowers and crumbs, which gradually piled up into a pile. Butler Jean waited quietly. He knew that every time Madame was doing chores, no one was allowed to disturb her except for the Crown Prince. However, the news that Shenli had sent over today seemed to be related to Macklin. Since it involved the Federation's presidential election, he had to report to Madame immediately. Butler Jean was momentarily perplexed as he watched Madame Tai's busy figure and the trace of a calm smile on her face. How many years had he watched Madame Tai like this? Even if it could affect the Federation's presidential election, he could not let this woman's emotions fluctuate too much. She was the most powerful woman in the Federation. Was she born with such a temperament? As the oil heated up, the onions and garlic boiled, and the mutton slid into the pot. An exotic aroma filled the room beside the temple. Not long after, Madame Tai scooped out the food in the pot onto a plate. Only then did she sigh softly and wipe away the few drops of sweat on her slightly red cheeks with satisfaction. She sat casually on the stone platform of the temple. 2 obedient and quiet maids had already prepared bowls, chopsticks, and white rice. There was a stone table and a futon. Madame Tai sat in front of the stone table. The tip of her chopsticks picked up a piece of mutton with a numbing aroma and put it into the rice. She carefully took a bite. After tasting it for a while, she smiled and said, "The next time Ah Yuan comes back, he'll definitely tell me that my culinary skills have improved." Butler Jean remained silent as he stood behind her. Although the afternoon sun was blazing, there was wind in the mountains, so it was not too hot. After finishing a bowl of white rice and half a plate of mutton, Madame Tai's nose was still dripping with sweat. The maids beside her brought over water and a towel. After freshening up, the maids cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks and retreated far away. There was a teapot and 2 teacups on the stone table. Madame Tai poured a cup for herself before gently pointing at the other empty cup. Steward Jean stepped forward and poured a cup for himself as well. However, he didn't sit down and merely stood there, taking a sip from the cup. The teacups were carved out of Ink Mountain stone. The natural color of the stone revealed traces of black silk that made one's heart feel cold. The material was expensive and uncommon. The tea was frozen tea from the Meng Mountains. It was wrapped in the unique scent of the snowy mountains. After it was washed with water, it was deliberately cooled for 20 minutes. Now that it was poured out of the pot and frozen in the Ink Mountain stone cup, it was tasteless. When it entered the throat, a faint fragrance seeped out. Butler Jean silently savored the taste between his lips and tongue. Holding the slightly cold Ink Mountain stone cup between his thumb and forefinger, the slight trace of anxiety in his heart disappeared without a trace. His standing posture also became much more stable. "How's the investigation in the Donglin district going?" Madame Tai slowly put down the teacup. She no longer looked at the sea in front of the mountains. Instead, she glanced at the window under the eaves at the corner of the temple from the corner of her eyes. There seemed to be someone looking at her from there. Butler Jean was not surprised that Madame Tai was not concerned about the presidential election and was instead concerned about the incident in the Donglin district 2 years ago. Although he did not know the inside story of the incident, he vaguely guessed that the heavy expression on Madame Tai's face was related to Professor Jean. Furthermore, he was also shocked by the results of the investigation and was preparing to report back immediately. "Donglin is too far away. I only had time to make a long-distance report." Butler Jean knew that Madame Tai was very concerned about the realism of seeing someone face to face. However, there was nothing he could do about this. He said softly, "After Yu Feng escaped the Federation's arrest warrant, he changed his name to Feng Yu and opened a repair shop on Hushi Province's Xianglan Avenue." Under normal circumstances, Butler Jean would have thought that his report this time was too unimportant. This was because he did not know the relationship between the defected mechanic and Professor Jean. However, this was Madame Tai's main concern. Therefore, he followed the information in the report and reported it in detail from the beginning, even though Madame Tai already knew most of the information. Madame Tai sat quietly beside the stone table. Her sitting posture was different from that of anyone else in the Federation. Her body was slightly bent backward, pressing down on her own legs. It seemed like she was in a kneeling position, but her waist was extremely straight, like a white poplar tree. Her slightly loose light-colored hemp garment covered the pair of cloth shoes on her feet, completely hiding the curves of her body that were still extremely well maintained. She listened seriously and carefully to Butler Jin's report. On her quiet and peaceful face, the pair of eyes gradually lit up. A fugitive from the Federation who was designated as the top priority by the Bureau of Proclamation was actually able to endure loneliness and stay on that barren mineral planet for more than 10 years. He even took in an apprentice. Madame Tai's lips curved into a cold smile. There was an apprentice in Yu Feng's repair shop. His name was Su Lu. At the mention of this name, Butler Jean paused slightly. He glanced at Madame Tai's side profile and saw that she did not appear to be shocked. Only then did he continue quietly. "There are many witnesses in the area who can attest to this. At first, I was very shocked, but I didn't think that Su Lu was the current Su Lu. Because according to the Bureau of Proclamation's records, that orphan Su Lu from the Donglin district has already been confirmed dead by the charter. Because he was the top priority, the central computer carried out the strictest verification. No one within the Bureau of Proclamation was able to tamper with his death." After a long silence, Butler Jean said, "So, from a legal point of view, according to the Federation's records, that Su Lu was already dead 2 years ago. Butler Jean narrowed his eyes slightly, as if he himself did not quite believe the information reported back from the Donglin district. He lowered his head slightly and said softly, "But when the staff took out Su Li's photo for verification, the residents of Xianglan Avenue and Gulu Street all insisted that Su Lu was Su Lu. Su Lu was Su Lu." This was a very interesting sentence pattern. Madame Tai quietly placed her hands on top of each other on her lap. She quietly stared at the S3 deep East Sea in front of the mountain temple and asked softly, "It's already been 2 years. How can those residents still be so sure?" When comparing the photos, although that Su Lu from the Donglin district and this Su Lu look extremely similar, there are still some differences between their facial features. Butler Jean bowed and replied, "Their facial features are extremely similar, and then there's the smile. Those residents of Hushi district seem to have a hard time forgetting that smiling young helper in the repair shop. It's said that when Su Lu was in the Donglin district, he was very popular with the neighbors." Madame Tai did not expect this to be the reason. She could not help but laugh. After a moment of silence, Butler Jean said, "No one has ever thought that the charter computer would make a mistake. I don't think so either. So according to my analysis, there are only 2 possibilities." Madame Tai turned around and glanced at him. This could be a supernatural incident. Donglin's orphan Su Lu and Su Lu, a squatter from the capital ring, are indeed 2 different people. It's just that their facial features and auras are too similar, and their names just so happen to coincide. After Butler Jean said this, he could not help but sigh in his heart. This was indeed a preposterous theory, but the problem was that the second theory he was about to make next was, in his opinion, just as preposterous as a supernatural incident. In the 65th year of the constitutional era, the Federation's killing machine mechanic Yu Feng and his helper, Su Lu, died. At the same time, squatter Su Lu retired from the military, left the Donglin district, and returned to S1. Butler Jean said calmly, "These 2 incidents are too much of a coincidence, so the other possibility is that Su Lu is the helper that Yu Feng brought out. It's just that, through some unknown means, he was able to rearrange the files in the charter computer and hide from the glory of the charter." Butler Jean furrowed his brows. As a Federation citizen, he felt that the possibility of this happening was close to 0. Furthermore, the only way to achieve this was if Su Lu could change the microchip on the back of his neck. However, this possibility was something that he didn't even want to think about. "Think about the second possibility," Madame Tai calmly instructed. Unlike Butler Jean, she was not shocked that the Federation might have a chip changer who could go against the glory of the charter. This was because she had met such an amazingly talented man many years ago. That day at the lakeside behind Macho's back mountain, the moment she saw that little blue device, this most powerful madam of the Federation had basically confirmed Su Li's origin. However, she still had not confirmed whether Su Lu was alive or dead. "If it's the second possibility, I suggest that we immediately notify the Federation government." Butler Jean lowered his head and said softly. In Yue University, he had followed Tai Zhuan and had a few interactions with Su Lu. This old man who had served the Tai family for many years had a good impression of this clean and spotless little fellow. However, he knew that if things were as the madam had speculated, this little fellow's ability seemed to have threatened the very foundation of the Federation's existence. He's the primary suspect. If the family wants to protect him, once the matter is exposed in the future, the family will face unprecedented pressure from the Federation government. Most importantly, we will also have to bear the wrath of the Bureau of Proclamation. Chapter 229. Lady Tai's silence gave Butler Jean a bad premonition. The 7 major families of the Federation had been able to survive for so many years, so they naturally had many ways to control their huge industries and connections. However, every family had loyal subordinates who had served the main family for generations. The Tai family had ruled the empire, so there were even more loyal subordinates who did not reveal themselves. He was one of them. This old butler, who had first served the madam, then Tai Xuan, liked Su Lu, but he knew that Su Li's true identity would bring great harm to the Tai family's interests, as well as the madam. Most importantly, the information this young man had hidden after escaping to the capital ring was too terrifying. Therefore, after a moment of silence, he spoke first. Even if we can help Su Lu cover up, with his current development in the Federation, there will be a day when many people will notice him. Furthermore, he has exposed too many flaws, so the government will easily catch him. After saying this, he took out a piece of paper and placed it on the stone table. Then, he quietly stepped back and waited for the madam's decision. Lady Tai picked up the thin piece of paper with her fingertip. With her sharp eyes, it did not take long for her to discover the problem with the amount of money recorded on the paper. Lady Tai looked at the thin piece of paper quietly. The paper recorded the flow of millions of dollars. For the master and servant in the scene, this sum of money was not worth a second glance. However, this sum of money came from Su Li's 3 Forest Alliance bank card. In the end, it was transferred through the channels of the Federation's black market to an account in the Eastern Forest region. This was enough to prove a very serious problem. Although nostalgia is a very respectable emotion, it is also a very idiotic thing to do, especially when you don't have the ability to do so. Lady Tai stood up and returned the paper to Butler Jean. She said calmly, "That person called Li Wei was Su Li's friend in Eastern Forest?" "Yes." When this amount of money was transferred, that Li Wei had just been released from prison. The first person who saw a crab would definitely be frightened by such an ugly creature, but the second person who saw a crab would definitely not be so shocked. Lady Tai knew where Butler Jin's fear came from. She also knew what the chip on the back of Su Li's neck meant to the Federation. However, she had seen it before, so she was able to conceal her emotions perfectly. With her hands still resting quietly on her lap, Lady Tai narrowed her eyes and looked at the East Sea in front of her. It should be summer in S1, autumn in S2, and spring in S3. The green hills behind her were filled with wildflowers, and the beach in front of her had some plants growing stubbornly. At this moment, Madame Jean was reminded of many things, especially because of Butler Jin's solemn tone. She was reminded of the meeting that happened many years ago. That was in S1's Capital Special District. The president of that era and the director of the Bureau of Proclamation jointly invited her, her husband and the god of war, Lise of Philadelphia, into a small room. During that closed-door meeting, the president and the director's words and tone were very similar to what Butler Jean said in the temple today. The abnormal situation that the Federal Central Computer found shocked everyone present. After that intense argument, Tai Xuan's father, her husband, left in anger. The head of the Tai family, who created the romantic plot of the Double Moon Festival, was a good person full of humanity. No matter how one thought about it, he couldn't make that kind of decision because it would definitely betray and hurt his friend. However, everyone in that room knew that if they couldn't control that person with that person's temperament, the books that he wrote, and the things that he did, the glory of the Charter would one day dim, and the political system of the Federation would start to falter. Once the first Charter lost its effect, the people would start to look at those politicians and big families with hatred. The human Federation, which spanned hundreds of light years, would definitely fall apart. Every district and every administrative planet would become independent, and civil war would ensue in the Federation. When that time came, what kind of hell would the Federation become? There was also the Imperial armies, who were already showing their sharp teeth at that time. If they were allowed to control that man's mind, would the Federation forever become a colony of those barbarians? Therefore, when the head of the Tai family left in anger, Madame Tai stayed behind. This was because from the first day she married into the Tai family, She had knelt in front of her parents-in-law and swore that she would definitely help her husband to continue the Tai family, so that the Federation could exist peacefully in the universe forever. That military god from the Lees of Philadelphia also signed his name after a long period of silence. Unfortunately, the later changes in the situation were more or less out of the expectations of these two people. His Excellency the President initially wanted to control, but that man who had thousands of incarnations didn't want to be controlled at all. In fact, he couldn't control him at all. Only the heavens knew how the Lees of Philadelphia gave birth to these two monsters, who actually had such powerful abilities. The Federation government and the Bureau of Proclamation's secret pursuit, because of that man's tenacious resistance towards freedom, evolved into a pursuit that spanned many years and many galaxies. During this process, who knew how many Federation soldiers died and how many news events shocked the Federation? The sea breeze mixed with the mountain breeze, slightly salty and cool, brushing past the stone platform in front of the temple. Madame Tai woke up from her memories. She actually felt a bit cold, subconsciously shrinking her body. She actually felt a bit disappointed about the decision she made back then. Back then, there were only 5 people who participated in that closed-door meeting. It just so happened to be the same number of people as the group of 5 that led humanity out of the darkness after the catastrophe countless years ago. The contents of that meeting were only known to these 5 people. Even if the other great families of the Federation's 7 great families vaguely found out some things, they still had no way of coming into contact with the truth. His Excellency the President, with the help of Li Pifu of Philadelphia, ultimately led the entire Federation to defeat the barbaric invasion of the Imperial armies. Then, he passed away from illness amidst the cheers of tens of billions of Federation citizens and the sounds of fireworks by the windows. At the time, Madame Tai was at His Excellency the President's side. Even today, she still believed that His Excellency the President of that time was the most outstanding politician in the history of the Federation. After the war ended, that figure who was revered as a military god by the people also returned to the lakeside of the Lees of Philadelphia to retire. The federal military and the people always thought that this person didn't want his lofty prestige to affect the normal operations of the Federation's political system. Therefore, they revered him even more. However, this was actually only a part of the reason. In the Federation, only Madame Tai knew that this military god must have felt sad and guilty that he had personally sent his brother into that huge explosion. Such sadness could only be soothed by returning to his hometown by the lakeside. The reason why she knew was because she also felt the same way. Madame Tai narrowed her eyes and looked at the surface of the sea. However, the hands in her sleeves gently clenched. She thought of that huge explosion in the Donglin region 2 years ago. It wasn't until the Federal Central Computer once again discovered that man's existence through an electric baton that these important figures who had felt sad and guilty for many years, finally realized that everything was fake. That huge explosion on the Empire's resource planet didn't kill him at all. That's right, Professor Jean, Mechanic Yufeng, George Carlin, these people who had countless incarnations and walked the universe with their own abilities. How could they die so easily? Every time Madame Tai thought of her husband's incomprehension, anger, and indifference towards her after that huge explosion more than 10 years ago, she would feel better until he died. However, that man hid on that desolate mineral planet as if nothing had happened, drinking small amounts of alcohol, smoking small amounts of cigarettes, raising his disciple, and visiting prostitutes at the sanatorium punctually every week. Madame Tai was furious. Her respectable husband did so much for that so-called friend, but that person was so heartless and only cared about his own happiness. When it came to being heartless, as expected, no one was more ruthless than him. "I hope you're really dead this time," Madame Tai said in an extremely cold tone. The ancient bell that was secretly controlled by the 4th Military Region was originally a modified battleship. Although the power of the main cannon wasn't necessarily more powerful than that of the huge explosion more than 10 years ago, it was more concentrated. Furthermore, the person who personally took action at the front line was a powerful figure like Fatty Tian. Logically speaking, that man shouldn't be able to survive. However, the problem was that she had seen that man create too many miracles with her own eyes, so she wasn't so sure. Butler Jean had been standing behind her silently, waiting for orders. Madame Tai stood up and gently adjusted her cuffs. She said slowly, "This matter can't be known to anyone else. Recall all the personnel in charge of the investigation. Also, send someone to monitor that person called Li Wei and find a suitable way to bring him to Bermuda." Butler Jin's body trembled. From these few orders, he knew that Madame Tai definitely didn't intend to tell the government about Su Li's true identity. He didn't expect Madame Tai to make such a decision and was momentarily stunned. Madame Tai didn't care about the shock in his heart. She raised her head slightly and allowed the cold sea breeze to blow away the blazing sun on her linen clothes. She thought silently in her heart, "If you're still alive, I'll use Su Lu to lure you out. Let's see if you're really so heartless that you don't care about anyone. If you're really dead 2 years ago, I'll try to control your student. Many years ago, we failed. I really want to know if we'll succeed this time. If we don't, I'll send him to the Netherworld Sea to accompany you." The most powerful madam in the Federation smiled as she looked at the blue sea that was getting darker as the sun moved westward. She stood up and walked towards the old temple. Butler Jean bowed slightly to send her off. His heart felt extremely heavy because of Madame Tai's decision. However, that old temple wasn't a place he could set foot in, so he couldn't persuade her even if he wanted to. He just felt that Madame Tai might have made a huge mistake this time. Su Lu didn't know that on a planet several light years away, there was a conversation about him happening. He also didn't know that Madame Tai had already found out his true identity and had decided to use him to lure out that heartless uncle, or to completely control him in her hands. If it was the former, then there would definitely be schemes and dangers. If it was the latter, then there would definitely be methods and pressure, until he completely lost his freedom. Freedom was the most basic requirement that every person had outside of survival. In short, a crisis was slowly approaching this fugitive's body, but he didn't know anything about it. Right now, he was even lamenting the power of the Tai family hidden within the Federation. He completely didn't know that the more powerful Madame Tai was, the more difficult his life in the universe would be in the future. His cooperation with the Tai family had been very pleasant. After just a trip to the Nutshell Engineering Department, the other party had given him enough authority to even send a military mecha to Whitewater Company in such a short period of time. Even if it was one of the 7 great families of the Federation, it was still a little shocking that they could do all this. What made Su Lu even more shocked was that the Tai family could influence the Nutshell Engineering Department and even tamper with Whitewater Company to get that CEO to cooperate. This kind of influence was really frightening. He even wondered, was the Shell Motor Company part of the Federation or the Tai family? This was his emotional reaction when he saw the M37 just now. Right now, Su Lu couldn't care less about these things. He was currently standing with several logistics personnel at the control panel behind the super-strong glass. Looking at the silhouette of the black mecha in the mecha room, he clenched his fists tightly from time to time, feeling a little nervous and excited. The black M37 mecha was moving quickly in the spacious mecha room. The old-style single engine was at full power, letting out a low humming sound. However, these sounds seemed to be unable to keep up with the black mecha's own high-speed movement. Although the mecha room was spacious, it still seemed a little small for a 6-meter-tall military mecha to move quickly and evade in there. However, the black mecha was being operated smoothly like flowing water. Every action was simple, fast, accurate, and effective. There were absolutely no redundant commands. When it was evading, there was no obvious deceleration, and there were no scenes of it crashing into obstacles. Only the most excellent pilots could operate such a heavy mecha and still make such smooth reactions at this speed. The electronic data collection devices on the ceiling of the mecha room were working non-stop, faithfully transmitting the control data of the black mecha back to the control panel. Those staff members looked at the data nervously and couldn't help but exclaim softly in shock. After this M37 had started moving, it had never stopped. The 7-minute-long test of evading and speed had been completed in one go, as awe-inspiring as the rushing of a river. And those feedback data proved just how terrifyingly fast the hand speed of the pilot in the mecha had reached in this period of time. Even someone like Su Lu, who had not been in contact with mecha operations for long, could see the pilot's extremely talented control ability and that trace of awe-inspiring beauty in the black mecha's clean and efficient movements. With a soft beep, the black M37 instantly turned from extreme motion to extreme stillness. The power of the 3 engines was retracted, and the mechanical legs stood firmly in the center of the circle. The entire body of the mecha did not tremble at all, ending the entire test with an extremely perfect standard tactical movement. With the sound of compressed air being released, the cabin door of the black M37 opened. A delicate man jumped out of the mecha, tucking his hands into his trousers out of habit, ignoring the drop of sweat dripping from his hair. Chapter 230. The self-maintenance equipment silently drove into the spacious mecha battle room, making a soft beeping sound. Underneath the smooth and sturdy floor, a few probes extended from the center of the circle and connected to the black M37 mecha's abdomen port. They began testing the control computer and removing redundancy. Everything appeared to be very organized and orderly. However, the control panel was already bustling with activity. Looking at the handsome man gradually approaching, the logistics technicians of the Whitewater Company's underground base began to clap and stomp their feet. Some even whistled. They had seen too many mecha tests in their lives and were already numb to it. However, today, this secretary of Team 7 had given them a big surprise. The data that the black mecha had sent back earlier was very shocking. A pilot with such control ability would definitely be an ace pilot in the Federal Army. Of course, as the federal military's biggest secret contractor, Whitewater Company had also had its ace pilots come here to carry out missions under different identities. However, these high and mighty pilots would not stay in the base for long. Often, after completing their missions, they would return to the Army. They had not even come to Whitewater Company's headquarters. "Do you want to take a shower first?" Su Lu walked down from the control panel and looked at by Magnolia, who had her head lowered. This man always had his head lowered out of habit. Perhaps it was to hide his overly delicate features, or perhaps he did not want to see anything. "I didn't sweat too much," by Magnolia replied softly. The whistling on the control panel continued. Su Lu turned back and smiled. He asked, "Does it feel like this in the Army too?" By Magnolia was silent for a moment before saying, "It's even more exaggerated than this." Su Lu had seen with his own eyes how Bai Yulan operated the M37 mecha as smoothly as flowing water. Although there had not been any actual combat practice, he knew that this delicate man was definitely very impressive. Otherwise, the Federation military would not have given the task of testing the latest model of the MX mecha to Team 7. The problem was that even though Team 7 had become one of the scapegoats for the failure of the MX experiment, the other combat members of the team had all been transferred back to their original units. They were either grounded or on vacation. Only Magnolia remained at the Whitewater Company. How could the federal military forget such an outstanding pilot? As the two of them walked out of the base, Su Lu suddenly asked, "What unit were you originally in?" "Special Mecha Battalion of the 17th Armored Division of the 1st Military Region." Bai Yulan knew what his question was. She said indifferently, 3 years ago, My class was on a mission at the outskirts of Bermuda. We encountered the 1st Mecha Battalion of the Empire's Royal Special Forces. Everyone was annihilated. I was the only one who escaped back to the rescue ship. Although his words were calm and natural, Sulu could hear a trace of unwillingness and pain in his words. After the end of the war more than 10 years ago, the Federation and the Empire maintained peace on the surface. However, in reality, both sides were still constantly probing each other in the intersecting star field. Sporadic conflicts and casualties had never stopped. The 4th Military Region was stationed at the space passage to the Magellanic Nebula in the West Woods region. It was a place that both the Federation and the Empire had to fight over. These past few years, wars had been ongoing on those resource planets and even barren planet. Meanwhile, the Bermuda Triangle star field was the best place for both sides to test each other's military strength. I was the class monitor. Originally, I should have been court-martialed. However, my original commanding officer pleaded for me, so I was sent to the Whitewater Company. I've been there for a few years now. My personality is a bit strange. I've killed too many people and I like money too much. That's why no one likes me. After briefly explaining her origins and background for the first time, Bai Yulan never talked about herself in front of Sulu again. This habit lasted for a long time. The two of them walked out of the underground base and followed the self-propelled caterpillar to the platform on the side of the Whitewater Company building. It was almost evening. The sun of the S1 system was moving in the opposite direction. The bright red light shone in the sky above the large Federation farm next to the Whitewater Company, turning the green vegetables into burning flames. Sulu lit his lighter and put his cigarette near the flame. He did not give Bai Yulan a cigarette because he knew that she would not smoke. He looked at Bai Yulan's thin body leaning against the wall of the platform from the corner of his eye. He felt a little strange. Such a surprisingly calm, girl-like man could make that heavy M37 as fierce and agile as a cheetah once he entered the mech. "Can you teach me how to operate a mech?" Sulu took a puff of his cigarette and asked casually, as if he had suddenly thought of this matter. By now, his understanding of mecha was already extremely deep. In Yue University, he had done countless practice runs and even sparred with Tai Zhuan many times. But today, after witnessing Bai Yulan's mecha with his own eyes, he finally knew how big the gap was between him and Tai Zhuan. The key was not the movements, but the fluidity of the black M37's evasive maneuvers. Sulu believed that without using the simulation system, if Bai Yulan were to engage in a mech battle with him, she would only need 2 rounds to successfully use the mech's speed to break through his mech's defenses and knock him out. With your understanding of mecha's structure, it won't be difficult for you to master a mech. Bai Yulan was not surprised that Sulu would make such a request. He leaned against the wall of the platform and looked at the vegetable garden outside. He said softly, "The military mecha I usually operate have joysticks. The joysticks are used to simplify commands and directly control the direction of the mech's movement. Below the joysticks are 17 sensitive buttons. They have the same function, but they are basically used to control the firepower system. The prototypes you've worked with before did not have such a setup, so you need to first familiarize yourself with these components. After familiarizing yourself with them, you need to familiarize yourself with the standard military movements. For example, the set of movements I used to test the M37 just now is the tip of the triangular assault formation." Sulu asked curiously, "I've heard of this before, but I don't think I've ever heard of a defensive formation. The greatest advantage of a mech in modern warfare is its mobility. Although the alloy armor's bullet resistance is already very high, it is still unable to withstand the concentrated attacks of heavy firepower. So the key is to touch and leave." Touch and leave was clearly a jargon used by the Federal Army. Sulu did not quite understand. "It means to sneakily touch a girl's butt and run away before her boyfriend can react." Such a vivid metaphor," That's really rare. Yes, this saying was passed down from the special forces of the 4th Military Region. Because of the image, everyone remembers it. Bai Yulan lowered her head and said, "The characteristics of a mech lie in these aspects. It is a terrifying fighting machine that is born to be used for assault. If it is used for defense, that would be a huge waste. It would be better to stack up a few dozen heavy armored vehicles." The special forces of the Federal Army do not have the bad habit of playing defense. The delicate-looking man continued in a slightly mocking tone, "In this universe, only the Empire would design a special mech defensive formation. That's because those are the royal mechs, to ensure the safety of those noble princesses and princes." Su Lu shrugged his shoulders. Apart from seeing the Empire's diplomats on TV and those captives who swore to be enemies with the Empire, he really didn't have any direct knowledge of that distant enemy country. However, after hearing Bai Yulan's words, he couldn't help but imagine such an embarrassing scene in his mind, and he couldn't help but laugh. Bai Yulan suddenly stared at his face and said seriously, "Of course, if you can help the Federation make the MX, the maneuverability at 4 times the normal power output is frightening beyond imagination. A mech like this can be thrown into a direct battle. Even if it is surrounded by an entire Empire armored battalion, there is still a possibility of breaking through. The MX is a completely new generation of mecha. This will require the military pilots to adapt and even research new battle strategies to be able to bring out the full potential of the MX's maneuverability. This will take a very long time. From the time the new mech is developed to the time it is equipped, the military will need at least 1.5 years to get used to it." After a moment of silence, Su Lu opened his mouth to ask, "Are you ready?" Bai Yulan's head was still lowered, but his delicate-looking eyes were narrowed. From the last trip to Hong Kong, he already knew what Su Lu had arranged for him to do. However, no matter which angle he looked at it from, he could not resist this temptation. "You will be the Federation's first pilot for the MX mecha." Su Lu looked at him and said. After all, Bai Yulan had once operated a dual-engine mecha, so he had a natural advantage in this aspect. Moreover, Su Lu could not allow the secret of his ability to use the simulation system to operate mecha to be exposed. Thus, this delicate-looking man in front of him was his best choice. "I've been preparing for this." Bai Yulan raised his head and smiled faintly. "Sometimes when I think about it, I should be the one giving you 20 million. To be the new generation's chief pilot for the MX mecha was bound to be a great honor, which was why Bai Yulan had said so." Su Lu only noticed the other's smile. For the first time, he found that Secretary Bai could also shine brightly under the sun. "I've operated mecha before, but I always felt that when you were operating the M37 earlier, the mecha's movements seemed to have some sort of rhythm. After operating for a long time, I'm familiar with it. I've memorized all the standard combinations. Every mecha will be imprinted with the pilot's personal habits and movement. We usually call this the mecha's style." "Madmanly, you should know what style his mecha is?" Su Lu suddenly asked with a frown. Bai Yulan looked at him quietly and said seriously, "One year, I once saw him in the West Woods. He opened wide and closed wide, crazy as could be. Probably only the old war god could raise such a grandson. I know that your individual combat ability is very strong, so strong that you don't fear him. But I'm warning you, if Madmanly is in a mecha, you'd better stay away, even if you're operating the MX. Chapter 231. What's the style of the mecha you operate? Su Lu asked curiously as he finished the last puff of his cigarette. No style. Bai Yulan leaned against the wall of the platform and replied softly, "Maybe it's just more accurate." Su Lu shrugged. Although he was not satisfied with this answer, there was nothing he could do. A true ace mecha pilot's battle style could only be displayed on a real battlefield. It was indeed difficult to describe it with words. He was just a little curious. When this young lady by Yulan truly operated her mecha to the extreme, would she also have the same tranquil, elegant, and natural look as if she was grooming herself in front of a mirror? As the sun continued to set, the Federation's farm on the other side of the courtyard wall also began to quietly shake off the sea of fire. It became a quiet green oil painting, gradually dimming until it was almost impossible to see clearly. Sulu took a set of car keys from Bai Yulan's hands. Carrying the heavy black leather suitcase, he hurriedly left Whitewater Company and headed straight for the place he had agreed to meet with Secretary Shun. It was a very ordinary fast food restaurant. Sulu sent the file hidden in the workbench to Secretary Shun's portable computer. Frowning, he said, "In the past, I had an agreement with Tai Zhuan. He promised me that he would do his best to prevent that person from being elected as the Federation's vice president. But that fellow disappeared without a trace. I don't know where he went. You don't have to say anything. I won't ask you. It's just that since he ran away so irresponsibly, I have to do something. The things in this file should be of some use to you. I hope you can use them well." Secretary Shun gently stirred the instant coffee in front of him. He smiled silently, but his mood was a little strange. He did not know that the Crown Prince had actually made such an agreement with Sulu before. He raised his head and very sharply sensed that Sulu was looking at something out of the corner of his eye. His smile deepened and he said, "You don't have to look for him. When I go out to do things, I don't have the habit of bringing people with me." Sulu was indeed looking for Secretary Shun's bodyguard. Shunli was now Lady Tai's chief secretary. He stood at the front desk and was in charge of handling the communications between the Tai family and the outside world. Tai Zhuan had gone to S2 and remained silent. From a certain perspective, Secretary Shun was equivalent to the Tai family's spokesperson in the Federation. His safety was naturally of the utmost importance to the Tai family. Hearing Xin Li's explanation, Sulu smiled and began to focus on destroying the 4 pieces of bread on the plate in front of him. He did not have the habit of bringing people with him. On one hand, it showed that he was like Shi Qinghai, a person who came from the First Academy and was extremely confident in his abilities. On the other hand, since the entire Federation knew that Secretary Shun was the representative of the Tai family, who would dare to provoke him? The Tai family had only one son for 7 generations. Perhaps there would be some daring people who dared to plot against Tai Zhuan's life and death. However, if they wanted to kill Secretary Shun, other than angering the Tai family, there would be no benefit. Although Secretary Shun's explanation was simple, it was filled with endless confidence in the terrifying abilities of the Tai family. Sulu chewed on the bread and couldn't help but feel a little shaken. This was probably the magnanimity that came from having power. Secretary Shun didn't know that his words had caused Sulu to think so much. He was just a little surprised at this young man's appetite. Sulu had already eaten 4 pieces of bread and drank 3 cups of soy milk, but Sulu still didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. Sulu lowered his head and tore the bread into a few pieces. He felt that someone was staring at him. With the bread crumbs in his mouth, he vaguely explained, "I get hungry easily, especially after working." In just a few minutes' time, Sulu had memorized the positions and functions of the 17 sensitive touch buttons on the control stick. Not long after that, he had familiarized himself with the control stick's method of borrowing data and commands. His left hand began to operate the mecha smoothly. After all, he had been immersed in the design of mecha since he was young. In the past 2 years, he had conducted serious, even obsessive, research on the Federation's M-Series mecha. It was not difficult for him to familiarize himself with the control methods of military mecha. His left hand controlled the control stick, while his right hand slid along the ergonomic sliding slot on the touch screen. Through the helmet that covered most of his face, the rapidly scrolling analysis images appeared on the screen before his eyes. The infrared sensors and vision of the M37 mecha's head were accurately transmitted to Su Li's eyes. Su Lu took a deep breath and pushed the control stick slightly. The 5 fingers of his right hand moved as fast as lightning as he entered several data commands on the touch screen. In the airtight control room, he could not hear the powerful roar of the engine at the back of the mecha's waist. However, he could clearly feel a large propulsive force penetrating his body from the attachment pad below his buttock. It was just like the feeling of riding a space shuttle from the ground into outer space. However, this propulsive force was much more ferocious, and the vibrations were so great that the average person would find it hard to bear. Su Lu was no stranger to this feeling. In Area H1 of Ua University, he had once operated the M-Series prototype mecha to perform many Level 6 mecha tests. He had also sparred with Tai Zhuan many times. Thus, after more than half a year, he only needed a few seconds to get used to this feeling and even vaguely fall in love with it. The black M37 mecha began to operate at high speed. Wearing his helmet, Su Lu narrowed his eyes, enjoying the thrill of the mecha's large-scale leap. Being inside the alloy mecha, he could not feel the wind blowing against his face, so there was not much of a sense of high speed. However, the intense vibrations and the additional pale green images in the helmet's vision compared to the real world, those images that flashed by quickly allowed Su Lu to easily capture the feeling of mechanical power and human will merging into one. This was probably a kind of awe-inspiring feeling that could destroy and protect everything. Perhaps calling it awe-inspiring was not the right word. Su Lu stared at the data feeds on the pale green image, and through the control stick and the data commands in his right hand, he quickly adjusted the mecha's evasive posture, rotation, and leap. He did not close his eyes, but his mind wandered a little. He thought of a work on aesthetics that the uncle had forced him to read at Hushi State University. In that work, one of the Federation's most famous aesthetics experts in the 17th constitutional era had put forward an argument that the ultimate, most soul-stirring beauty in the world was silence. That was silence. Although the teleportation of a human mecha was incomparably fast, and its maneuverability in a small space was extremely strong due to the solemnity of the mecha's metallic nature, when compared to the relative stillness of the pilot in the cockpit, it could create a kind of serene beauty. Perhaps this was somewhat contradictory, but it was also so natural. One person operating a heavy mecha up to 6 meters tall, feeling the faint presence of machinery and electrical elements in the cockpit. All around him, there was only the faint static from the listening devices and the heavy footsteps of the mecha coming from the cockpit. There was extreme stillness within extreme movement. Su Lu suddenly had an illusion. Controlling the mecha, as long as he was calm, he would be a black reef in the ocean, and as long as he moved, he would be a violent meteor streaking through the atmosphere, able to burn a scorched scar into the blue sky at any time. His heart skipped a beat, and he could no longer control the desire in his heart. Tossing aside all the standard federal military movements in his mind, his left hand turned the control stick abruptly, and his right hand swept across the touch screen. Within 1 second, he had entered 4 data commands in succession, and the engine behind the M37 mecha's waist abruptly reversed. "You're crazy! Don't do this kind of action!" An extremely furious voice suddenly rang out from within the helmet. Usually, the owner of that voice was used to speaking softly and softly, but at this moment, he was actually so angry. Su Lu was slightly taken aback, but he was already unable to stop the M37 mecha from kicking up its right mechanical leg after a sudden turn of the body. The heavy body of the mecha instantly flew upwards, drawing a beautiful line in the air. Bai Yulan held a cup of tea, silently observing the activity in the mecha combat room. However, his heart was not as calm as he appeared on the surface. Su Lu had tossed him 20 million so casually, so he was already prepared to risk his life. However, the more he interacted with this seemingly ordinary young man, the more he felt that the other was not ordinary. At least, he was very sure that if he did not have a gun by his side, he would definitely not be willing to engage in close combat with Su Lu. Since that was the case, how could he risk his life? What surprised him even more was Su Li's current performance in operating the mecha. He had never imagined that someone who had only come into contact with military-use mecha for the first time would actually be able to operate the mecha to such an extent in such a short period of time. He knew that Su Lu was a freak, a genius in the field of mecha repair. He had also come into contact with prototype mecha at Lihua University, but he still could not understand how Su Lu had managed to do this. Although the movements of the M37 in the mecha combat room were somewhat sluggish and stiff, from the feedback of the data, the quality of Su Li's execution of the standard military movements was not bad, and his evasive response was shockingly high. This kind of performance was too shocking, unless Su Lu was a naturally thick-skinned person who had no fear of the unknown. Bai Yulan did not know that Su Li's reaction when operating the mecha was basically through the heat flow in his body. His nerves were indeed thicker than the average person's. Bai Yulan was very satisfied, even a little surprised by the first performance of the M37. Holding his teacup, he thought to himself, this freak Su Lu now only lacks familiarity with the mecha, and the experience cultivated through countless real battles. Of course, experience was also the most important thing. Just like driving a car, a newbie could still drive a car on the road. A thick-skinned newbie like Su Lu could even drive a car at 200 kilometers per hour, but he could not be like a real racing driver, who could still perfectly avoid obstacles and protect himself at high speeds. If he could go to the front lines and train for 6 or 7 years, he might really be able to pilot a mecha and go up against Madman Li. As Bai Yulan thought this, he noticed from the corner of his eye that the high-speed M37 mecha was performing an extremely difficult extreme braking maneuver on the slippery ground. He abruptly raised his head. The sturdy alloy mecha's mechanical legs had tracks attached to them in combat mode, and the alloy toes were used to grip the ground. When braking at high speeds, this maneuver could be completed by relying on the power of the engine, but the heavy weight of the mecha's cockpit could not be absorbed by the mecha's automatic deformation. It basically had to be placed entirely on the pilot's body. The heavy mecha's brakes created a long trail of sparks and smoke on the slippery, hard floor. Bai Yulan's eyes narrowed, not understanding why Su Lu had suddenly performed such a maneuver. Then, he noticed that after the heavy impact, the black mecha's body had sunk slightly, but its right mechanical leg had been raised. Mecha combat technique. A suicidal jump attack. Bai Yulan stood up abruptly and shouted into the communicator, "You're crazy!" Chapter 232. After these 3 words, Bai Yulan had wanted to say a few more, but then she stopped abruptly. Because she had already seen that the black M37 had already leapt off the ground amidst a piercing whistle. Following a powerful kick from its right mechanical leg, the mecha which had released all of its power in an instant after its descent came to an abrupt halt. In mid-air of the spacious mecha combat room, the entire mecha hung upside down, swiftly drawing an arc in the air. The high-speed friction between the surface of the mecha and the air intensified, and the whistle became even more shrill. The black mecha seemed to have come to a halt in mid-air, abruptly ending its upside-down action. Amidst a series of loud metallic noises, the mecha began to fall rapidly towards the ground. However, in that very short period of time, the mecha which had clearly been on the verge of losing its balance seemed to have been injected with power once more. It forcefully twisted its waist and abdomen, separating the 2 mechanical legs in front and back, and stood firmly on the solid ground. With 2 muffled clangs, the thick mechanical legs of the black M37 bore the brunt of the tremendous force, stomping 2 small deformed pits into the solid metal floor of the combat room. Meanwhile, the mechanical legs of the mecha also began to tremble, as if it could topple over at any moment. But it did not topple over. Forcefully maintaining its balance, the engine continued to pump out power, allowing the mecha to continuously perform fine maneuvers and adjustments under this precarious situation. In the end, it successfully completed this rough landing. Amidst the hissing sounds of hydraulic transmissions, the black mecha slowly descended about 20 centimeters. All the important metal joints were readjusted, and the engine slowly reduced its output power, no longer moving. The two mechanical legs were one in front and one behind, but the mechanical arms were extended in midair to help balance the mecha. In this movement, the massive mecha seemed so quiet and powerful. Bai Yulan stared silently at the motionless mecha under the control panel. Her rapidly beating heart gradually calmed down, but her eyes narrowed slightly. From this black M37, she had actually found a sense of serenity. This was of course not a standard military mecha combat move. In the federal military textbooks, there had never been a case of jumping into midair to court death like this. The mobility of a military mecha, which weighed up to several tens of tons, relied on its powerful engine, as well as the massive reaction force provided by the planet's surface. Just like the slogan of the first military academy's mecha department, mecha cannot exist in a castle in the sky. Mecha must be grounded. The act of leaping in midair was a move that every fighter pilot in the military had to master. However, the violent mid-air somersault like the black M37 just now was a test of the pilot's control in the instant before landing. This was because as the mech itself rotated at high speeds, the automatic balancing system used to stabilize the mech would experience a short period of data loss. This was especially true for the black M37's additional action of the mid-air leg splits. The calculations and command output required at the last moment were unimaginably difficult. Don't do this again. If you were in the army, you would have been grounded by your superiors. Bai Yulan said quietly into the communication device. He had concealed the shock in his heart very well. Although he thought that Su Lu was a freak, he still believed that this guy was just lucky to be able to land the M37 safely. The mechanical legs of a fighter mecha are mainly used for evasion and movement, but the attack method is focused on the upper body's firepower system and combat skills. Although because of the simulation of operations, humans are still the most suitable to pilot humanoid mecha, but a mecha is not a human body. If you still have to make lower body movements at high speeds, you will only fall very badly, Bai Yulan said seriously into the communication device in an indifferent tone. In the cockpit of the black M37 below the control panel, Su Lu listened to the sound from the helmet and was silent for a long time. Then, he took off the helmet and carelessly rubbed his hair that was completely wet. He himself did not know why he had done that action just now. It was indeed completely against the requirements of the military's teaching materials, but he had the urge to do it, and he had done it. However, listening to the data analysis of the onboard computer and Bai Yulan's warning, he felt a faint lingering fear in his heart. In that last moment before landing, there had indeed been some danger. If it had not been for the warm current in his body converting his will into data input between his fingers at the fastest speed possible, the M37 beneath him might have really slammed into the ground. Based on the speed at which it had been traveling, the M37 would have been heavily damaged, and he would have been injured as well. Due to the excessive power output of the engine at the very last second, the mecha had automatically shut down some energy-consuming functions, so the temperature in the cockpit was somewhat stuffy. Su Lu exhaled softly, wiping away the beads of sweat that had trickled down his chin. Suddenly, he thought, just how fast was his hand speed at the very last second? Only those idiots who think of themselves as geniuses would do such dangerous and useless actions. Bai Yulan held a teacup and looked at Su Lu, who had just finished showering beside her. She said calmly, Although I have never been to a military academy, I have heard from my colleagues that in the 3 major military academies and the Westwoods Military Academy's mobility department, every year, there would be a few idiots who did not follow the military standard manual and tried to operate a mecha to perform a flying kick, a flip fork, a 720-degree landing, these kinds of idiotic ideas, and were successfully injured from the fall. Sulu used a towel to dry his wet hair and smiled somewhat embarrassedly. He did not know that last year in the mecha combat room at Lihua University, Zhou Yu had once questioned his operation. After all, he had come from an unorthodox background. In Area H1's 6th level test, he had only known how to use all possible methods to dodge. How could he have known that mecha operation in real life was strictly prohibited from doing such things? But I feel that if these moves are mastered well, they should be very advantageous in close-range mecha combat. Sulu felt his arm go numb and he leaned back. A mecha's mobility mainly lies in its movement on the ground. Jumping into the air won't make your teleportation faster, and fancy movements won't make your attacks stronger. Bai Yulan took a sip of tea and said, "Actually, this is the same principle as close-range combat. I've observed your moves before. Both your feet have never completely left the ground. This shows that you understand this principle very well." Sulu was silent for a moment. The 10 stances that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him were all strange and heroic body movement technique. The footwork of both feet was indeed very strange, but in these 10 stances, there was indeed no leaping movement. In fact, both feet had never left the ground at the same time. Every step forward was a sliding step, and the distance between the feet was at most a few centimeters. Could it be that this was the reason? Su Li's eyes narrowed out of habit. Feeling the violent feeling of the mecha's legs in the air and the gravitational pull of the somersault, he felt that the combat between a mecha and a human should be different. Those movements made him feel very different, an indescribable feeling. "I'll be more careful in the future." Sulu smiled and said to Bai Yulan, "You can go back first. Thank you for teaching me so much today." These words were not out of politeness. For Sulu, who had come from an unorthodox background, to be able to operate a military mecha so skillfully in such a short period of time, it was definitely because Bai Yulan had imparted all her years of military experience to him. "Then I'll be leaving first." Bai Yulan did not stand on ceremony. Holding her teacup, she gently stood up and lowered her head to ask, "You still want to practice? We don't have any support staff at this time. If there is a problem, I'm afraid it will be more troublesome." Right now, it was already 11 o'clock at night. Sulu did not want anyone to see him operate a mecha. Of course, he did not mind that there were no support technicians around. He nodded at Bai Yulan. Bai Yulan was silent for a moment. Before she left, she said, "Don't think too much. After all, you're not from the Lees of Philadelphia." Sulu was the only one left in the spacious battle room. He rested for a moment, then walked over to the control panel and turned off all the data acquisition devices. He also turned on the automatic shutdown system outside the battle room. After confirming that it was late at night and that there was no one else around, he picked up the black leather case and jumped back into the cockpit of the M37. The cockpit was designed for a single person, but it had left some storage space, so there was no problem putting the black leather case inside. After passing the fingerprint check, he opened the black leather case and took out a set of clothes that looked very soft but were actually quite heavy. In reality, this was of course not clothes. It was an antique simulation system that Sulu had modified after he had been inspired by the database in Professor Shen's laboratory. The external material of this simulation system was a type of polymer material, but inside there were countless micron-scale sensor chips. It was extremely complex. If it had not been modified based on the design concepts of his predecessors, Sulu would probably never have been able to create this thing. Staring blankly at this simulation system, Sulu actually felt a little fearful for a moment. He did not know if he could actually succeed. His success in Area H1 had only been instantaneous. Being able to break through the defenses of Zhou Yu's mecha in that split second was all because of this. Li Xiaotong had invested 40 million. Other than the card he had given to Bai Yulan, most of the rest of the money had been invested in the modification of this simulation system. Compared to that, the workbench was really cheap. The interface between the simulation system and the M-series mecha had already been prepared beforehand. Although the input ports had long been removed from the later stages of the M-series mecha, the internal chip assembly lines had not been changed much. Su Lu began to carefully and seriously reconnect. Controlling a mecha was as crazy as driving a car, and modifying a mecha was as daring and reckless as modifying a car. Among the mechanical engineers of the Federation, probably only Su Lu, a student who had been led astray by Uncle Feng Yu, would do such a thing. After an indeterminate amount of time, Su Lu finally raised his head again and applied 2 drops of eye drop. Every strand of his freshly washed hair was covered in sweat. He exhaled lightly and licked his somewhat dry lips. Taking off his clothes, he put them into the black leather case and secured the case in the storage area. He pressed a button on a small tool in his hand. A faint blue light seeped out from his hand and quickly covered the entire cockpit. However, it did not penetrate the exterior of the mecha. Su Lu confirmed that this kind of interference would not affect the system of the mecha itself, and only then did he relax. He had already thrown away 2 of these little blue devices, and this was the 3rd one he had made. However, he was not worried, because the self-destruct mechanism of this little device was extremely powerful. Any attempt to crack the fingerprint lock would be blocked. No matter who picked it up, they would not be able to find out the true purpose of this little device. The structure of this little blue device was not complicated, but it could allow a person to temporarily hide under the brilliance of the first charter. Only the uncle's genius brain could have come up with such a nature-defying design. Su Lu took a deep breath and looked quietly at the blue light in his hand, drawing courage and confidence from it. Since he was the uncle's only student, his modification of the simulation system would definitely not fail. Wearing only a pair of underwear, Su Lu sat in the stuffy cockpit of the mecha like a naked and restless baby. After putting on the simulation system, he felt as if his body was covered with a heavy silk blanket. Every inch of his skin felt slightly taut. This phenomenon of the complete opposite of the sense of touch and pressure on his skin made it difficult for him to get used to in a short period of time. Plugging in the power supply and restarting the initial operation, the computer system was re-authenticated. The simulation system began to operate, and countless numbness appeared on his naked skin. Gradually, this feeling disappeared, but there were still some small prickling pains, as if many ants were courageously advancing into his pores. Fortunately, this feeling did not last long, otherwise Su Lu would definitely have thought that the awesome engineers of the previous generation had designed this kind of system purely for extorting confessions through torture. The cockpit door slowly closed, and the sealed air hissed for the last time. Then, the engine behind the tall M37 began to roar. However, Su Lu could no longer hear this sound. He could only look nervously at the data display in his helmet, waiting for the moment when the simulation system was completely connected. The black M37 still stood solemnly in the middle of the combat room. In the cockpit, Su Lu closed his eyes and slowly felt the wonderful sensation on his skin. Then, he began to mobilize the power in his body. A slightly scorching warmth flowed according to his will, quickly occupying his entire body. Following those wide channels, it passed through his bones, tendons, blood, and flesh, releasing slightly onto the surface of his skin. The simulation system collected physiological signals from the human body's muscles and skin. Su Lu seemed to have found a way for the simulation system to also identify the power in his body. This dual signal collection was the key to success. However, he did not have the slightest bit of confidence. It should be known that every success in the Federation's scientific career was based on countless failures. Sulu opened his eyes and looked at the pale green display screen before him. After a moment of silence, he moved his little finger. In the spacious combat room, the alloy finger hanging by the waist of the black M37 suddenly moved with a buzzing sound. So small, so wonderful. In the middle of the night, Bai Yulan returned to the Whitewater Company base. The CEO's office had specially allocated a mecha combat room for Team 7 to use. At this time, only he and Su Lu had the password to enter. He opened the door and saw the scene in the combat room. Subconsciously, he stopped in his tracks. Because of Uncle Kong's final words in front of the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong, Bai Yulan had been guessing Su Li's true identity. That was why he had mentioned the Lis of Philadelphia earlier. He had already left, but he was worried that Su Lu would listen to his warning and forcefully experiment with those dangerous mecha movements. So, he had turned back halfway. As one of the most cold-blooded and powerful pilots in the federal military, Bai Yulan had a lot of hidden abilities. He had even completed those dangerous movements before, and had done them even more beautifully. So, although he had been surprised by Su Li's comprehension, he had not thought much of it. After all, the purpose of a mecha was to attack the target, not to perform. However, at this moment, he saw a black mecha moving quickly in the combat room using a strange movement technique. At the highest level of speed, it actually moved and leaped easily, and then executed a mid-air chopping and somersaulting move. Bai Yulan's eyes narrowed. When he saw that M37 in Su Li's hands effortlessly execute 7 consecutive mid-air chopping moves, his right hand finally could not help but subconsciously reach into the left pocket of his shirt. He, who had never smoked, silently lit a cigarette for himself. He focused on that black mecha moving quickly and crazily as it moved forward. Even if this was a performance, this kind of ability was a little too frightening. Bai Yulan stuffed the cigarette between his lips and took a deep drag. Suddenly, he remembered the words he had said to Su Lu this afternoon. It looked like he had been wrong. Even if Mad Manly was in the mecha, this kid should still be able to put up a fight against that guy. He just needed some experience and killing intent. Su Lu did not know that night, Bai Yulan had personally witnessed him using the simulation system to operate his mecha. He had only confirmed one thing. Although that modified simulation system still had many flaws, such as being too inconvenient and slow in collecting data, it was already able to provide him with powerful support, allowing him to operate his mecha and perform those unimaginable moves. Of course, he did not give up on standard mecha training just like that. After all, if he wanted to operate a mecha in the future, the most important method would still be this joystick and touchscreen input method. Su Lu could not possibly modify all of his mecha to be like this M37. His performance during standard training puzzled Bai Yulan, because it was completely different from his crazy maneuvering that night. Moreover, Bai Yulan also noticed that M37 seemed to have been modified in some way by Su Lu. Su Lu was not worried that Bai Yulan would find out anything, because he trusted him, and he had to trust him. If he did not even have a trustworthy companion by his side, this kind of life would be a little too troublesome. Just like that, dozens of days quietly passed by in this kind of boring repetition. Zhou had long been discharged from the hospital, and the little baby was now even cuter than before. However, the distant wedding date made the minister's wife somewhat displeased, while Zhou Yu's brother seemed to have sensed something. During this period of time, Su Lu had gone to Hong Kong 4 times to speed up the process of helping the Nutshell Engineering Department develop the MX mecha. After all, an undercurrent was already surging towards that Senator Macklin, and the Empire was also making good use of this opportunity. After some thought, Su Lu decided not to let his personal hatred affect the interests of the Federation. Under the accompaniment of the muffled rain at the end of August, Su Lu and Bai Yulan once again boarded the high-speed rail, heading towards Hong Kong with great familiarity. However, at this time, neither of them could have imagined that there was a problem waiting for them. Chapter 233. In the short span of 2 months, Su Lu had already lost count of how many times he had come to Hong Kong. Returning to his old haunt in the rain, his mood was very relaxed, completely different from the first time he had come to Hong Kong. This bustling metropolis was no longer like that cold and indifferent monster. The girls on the streets with their tender breasts and tight thighs only made him feel very happy. The mountain torrents along New Yuezhou had long receded, so it was still early when the high-speed train arrived at Hong Kong. Outside the secret exit, there was already a car waiting for Su Lu and the other. Now, they were no longer staying at the Peninsula Hotel, but had directly gotten a temporary apartment in the industrial park. However, they had only stayed there a few times. Even the job of anonymously purchasing train tickets had been taken over by Secretary Shen. As early as a month ago, the Nutshell Engineering Department had formally reported to the relevant departments of the Federation government that the MX Mecha Research and Development Project had once again started. This kind of matter and the hidden meaning behind it would definitely attract the attention of a considerable number of people. Su Lu also didn't think that after coming here so many times and cooperating with the engineering department for so long, he could still keep it a secret from the Federal Academy of Science and the other powers, so he didn't really care much about Secretary Shen and the Nutshell Engineering Department's secrecy work. However, Secretary Shen and Chief Steward Jose seemed to be extremely confident in controlling the engineering department. In fact, until today, Su Li's underground work in the engineering department had indeed not been leaked. Because of this, Su Lu had a clearer understanding of the terrifying influence of the Tai family in the Federation. Only a few people knew about the research and development of the new generation MX Mecha. The tens of billions of people in the Federation had not heard anything. For them, the quadrennial Federation presidential election was the most important thing in their lives. Although no one had forgotten the shock caused by the terrorist attack on the peace concert in the 4 states during the summer holiday, it had also become a part of the presidential election. The leader of the anti-government forces, Nan Shui, accepted an official interview with the Federation news channel for the first time. He sternly denied that the armed forces in the mountains had anything to do with this terrorist attack, and also sternly condemned this violent method of harming the innocent. The anti-government forces used this extremely sincere gesture to slightly reduce the anger in the hearts of some Federation citizens. However, there were still more people who directly targeted them. Normally speaking, on the side of the presidential election, Senator Pabre should have remained silent after expressing his condemnation. Because at this time, every time he defended the anti-government forces, his political opponents could interpret it as, in order to protect his political capital to participate in the election, that illusory peace agreement, Senator Payable did not hesitate to turn black into white, forget his own position, and speak up for those butchers. However, this respected member of Parliament stood up bravely with a determination and stubbornness that was completely different from the Federation politicians. Through the glass of the freight car, Su Lu looked at the campaign posters on the street and narrowed his eyes. The background color on the posters was pure dark blue, and there was a silhouette in front. It was the silhouette of Senator Pabre when he arrived at the Green Dragon Mountain Airport by military plane on the last day of last year. The silhouette was very clear. The lower hem of the senator's windbreaker was blown up and then turned into a campaign slogan. "That's our president." He thought of the sentence Shi Qinghai said in the bar. At this moment, he naturally understood the deeper meaning of Mr. Shi's words. Although Su Lu very much appreciated the attitude of this fellow countryman, he had to admit that this approach was difficult to please in front of the voters. The public opinion poll conducted by the Federation News Channel the day before yesterday had already proven the problems caused by the attack on the concert and Senator Pabre's attitude after the incident. The election combination of Ross and Macklin was almost as good as Pabre's. "This is our president," Sulu said to himself in his heart. "There's a situation in front." The truck driver suddenly said in a deep voice. The specific process of Su Lee's entry into the Nutshell Engineering Department had been arranged by Blackhawk Security Company. With Xuen Yin's identity, it was naturally impossible for him to always be their driver, so the current driver was replaced. In the past few days there had been no problems, but what happened today? Su Lu glanced at Bai Yulan and was infected by the calmness of this delicate man. The worry in his heart was slightly reduced. At this time, the truck had just driven from the industrial park to the engineering department when it was stopped by a checkpoint. It was obvious that this was a temporary checkpoint. Sulu looked through a small crack at the black-clothed guards near the checkpoint. He suddenly felt that they looked familiar, and his heart skipped a beat. "People from the company," Bai Yulan lowered her eyes and said softly. Supervisor Jose had already prepared the entry and exit documents for the truck, but the guards at the checkpoint didn't seem to see those documents at all. They directly got on the truck, turned off the engine, and then opened the back compartment. Under the cold muzzle of the gun, Su Lu and Bai Yulan got off the truck. The port city, like the capital special district, was shrouded in the sultry August rain. The rain flowed down their hair. Su Lu looked at the well-trained and silent guards in black and understood what Bai Yulan meant. These people were professional mercenaries of the Whitewater Company. The rain gradually increased under the lights, but the black-clad mercenaries were not disorganized. They vigilantly escorted Su Lu and Bai Yulan to the checkpoint. The temporary checkpoint was only a few cars. In front of the headlights of a car, someone was holding an umbrella. Under the umbrella was an official wearing glasses. The Shell Motor Company was a core area of the Federation. In order to not attract public criticism, the security around the engineering department was basically handed over to the Federation's Whitewater Security Company. Since this company was basically the son of the Ministry of Defense, the Federation government was naturally very assured. Looking at the solemn-looking guards in the rain, Su Lu felt a sense of danger. But since they didn't intend to kill him at the beginning, it meant that they knew his background and didn't have the guts to do so. But when he saw the official, he felt that today's matter would be particularly troublesome. He had seen the official once in the Husk Institute. The official was the chief technical director of the Shell Motor Company's board of directors. He also held the position of an independent technical director. His position was very high and not ordinary people could compare to him. Under the black umbrella, the chief technical director of the Shell Motor Company looked coldly at Su Lu and Bai Yulan, who were escorted over, and said softly, "Whitewater Company's 7th technical director Su Lu and secretary Bai Yulan have violated the company's internal confidentiality rules and will be immediately detained for investigation. After the investigation, according to the relevant laws of the Federation, according to the facts of the crime, they will be transferred to the military court under the Ministry of Defense." Chapter 234. It was late at night in the outer area of the engineering department. It was raining heavily in August. The dark clouds covered all the nebulas. In the darkness, the headlights of the cars were somewhat dazzling due to the rain. Sula looked at the official under the umbrella and narrowed his eyes. He knew that the secret that he helped the engineering department was finally exposed. He just couldn't figure out whether the other party wanted to deal with him or to steal the fruit again. But no matter what, it shouldn't be the case that the big shot under the umbrella came to Hong Kong personally. Shell Motor Company was a giant Federation enterprise that prioritized technology. Under the supervision of the board of directors, the real backbone of the company was the engineering and technical staff. Su Lu was also one of the engineering and technical staff, but he was only a third-level technical supervisor. The official under the umbrella was the chief technical consultant of the Shell Motor Company. The chief technical consultant automatically became the independent technical director of the board of directors of Shell Motor Company. With the status of Shell Motor Company in the Federation, any member of the board of directors had great power and status. After the nutshell technical director under the umbrella finished speaking, he returned to silence. Through the pair of glasses, he waited for his answer. At this time, the rain was getting heavier and heavier. It stretched over the black umbrella above his head and splashed some water on the glasses. But the big shot didn't bother to wipe it off. He just looked at Su Lu and wanted to know if this important young man would resist. They were surrounded by White Water Company's guards in black rainproof combat suit. Su Lu knew that these people were either mercenaries who killed without batting an eyelid or special forces trained by the military. No matter how confident he was in by Yulan and himself, he didn't think of resisting because these black-clothed guards were holding their spears tightly. At this time, an umbrella came to Su Li's head and blocked the rain from falling from the sky. Su Lu looked back and saw Secretary Bai standing behind him with her head down. He didn't know when this person turned from beside him into an umbrella. The rainy night was dark and wet, and the industrial park was silent. Only the area illuminated by the headlights of the cars was still facing each other. The difference in the number of people on both sides was too great, so this confrontation seemed to be about to end. However, as soon as this umbrella appeared, only the independent director and Su Lu were not worried about the consequences. It subtly turned the atmosphere around. Su Lu looked at things with a sharpness that was completely inconsistent with his sincere appearance. From the moment he was stopped by the checkpoint to the appearance of this Mr. Independent Director, he quickly analyzed the situation and confirmed that the other party had a rough idea of his background, so he didn't dare to use force recklessly. However, the other party would definitely do everything possible to isolate him from the engineering department to ensure that the Federal Academy of Science would be the first to successfully develop Embark. He wiped the rain off his face, stared at the director's glasses and said, "I don't understand what confidentiality rules I violated. You don't have to explain anything. I am honored that you came here specifically for me, but I think you should know that I now have long-term access to the engineering department." As if she wanted to add momentum to Su Li's rebuttal, by Magnolia, who had been holding an umbrella behind him with her head slightly lowered, raised her head and coldly scanned the surrounding Whitewater Company guards. Her eyes were calm and quiet, but there was an extremely repressed coldness in them. The headlights of the cars were originally a little hazy due to the heavy rain, but the moment Magnolia raised her head, a flash of lightning suddenly flashed through the ink-like rain clouds in the sky, illuminating the dim world for a moment and revealing the delicate face in front of everyone. When the surrounding Whitewater mercenaries in black combat suits saw this delicate and quiet face, the originally cold and silent formation changed a little. It was not a commotion, but it was vigilance, absolute vigilance. This was because they all recognized this face. This face could only belong to Magnolia, the former combat manager of the company's 7th team. Within the Whitewater Company, this delicate man was not famous because no one was willing to talk about him. The Whitewater mercenaries, who killed without blinking an eye, felt fear from the depths of their hearts when they talked about this man who looked like a woman but was more ruthless than anyone else. The independent director looked at the two people in the rain indifferently. He had no desire to debate with them. Today's trip to Hong Kong was mainly to use his position in the company to suppress the backlash from the engineering department. As for Su Lu and the secretary behind him, he was a little afraid of their background, but he was not worried that they would dare to confront so many combat personnel directly. Although they were faintly uneasy, the combat personnel in black still pressed forward. They did not pay attention to Su Lu, who looked very ordinary. Instead, they focused most of their attention on the seemingly fragile By Magnolia. Their muzzles were aimed at his vital points, and their eyes did not leave his wrist. This was because they knew very well how terrifying this delicate man's close combat ability was. Back in the Bermuda Triangle Star region, this man even killed 7 Bermuda bandits with only a small knife. At this time, although the other party did not have a gun in his hand, they still did not dare to let their guard down. By Magnolia still held the umbrella, but she took a step forward and blocked in front of Sulu. Her left hand quietly reached into her trouser pocket. It was such a simple action, but it made the movements of the armed guards next to her pause. These people could feel the danger from By Magnolia's action, so they did not understand why By Magnolia, as an employee of the company, still wanted to protect Sulu despite the board's order. This was not in line with By Magnolia's usual style. Thinking of this, Sulu's figure became somewhat unfathomable in their hearts. Clearly, this young technical director did not have the slightest unusual aura, but he was able to subdue this beautiful knife. It was really hard to imagine. By some time, Sulu knew that the current situation was very troublesome. If he did not resist, with the other party's strong power in the Federation, they could easily put him under house arrest for many days without doing anything to him. The chief technical director, seeing Sulu's slightly moving lips, suddenly said with a smile, "Don't try to resist. Although I don't want to, I think there should be a lot of people who would like to see an accident happen." Sulu's palm gently rested on By Yulan's shoulder, preventing her from unleashing a vicious attack. At this moment, 2 people hurriedly ran over from the engineering department. They didn't even bother to use the umbrellas in their hands to block the rain. They angrily scolded the Whitewater Company's soldiers from the outside before rushing in. The independent director's face was a bit gloomy. Although he knew that there was absolutely no way to hide what happened tonight from the engineering department, he did not expect that Jose could discover the board's little trick in such a short time under the cover of the dark night and heavy rain. Manager Jose was soaking wet. Looking at the tense situation, he took a deep breath and calmed the anger in his heart. He looked back at the director and said in a deep voice, "I personally approved Sulu's long-term authority. Is there a problem?" "No problem." The director's face was slightly gloomy and he bluntly criticized, "You should know where your approval authority is. Do you not have any rules? Do you still have any respect for the board?" The Nutshell Company was a huge corporation. There were many departments under it, and an important territory like the engineering department naturally had a different status. If it were to be compared to an ancient dynasty, Jose was like a feudal lord. However, the independent technical director from the board was like an imperial envoy. Unless the engineering department dared to rebel, whether it was in terms of power or qualifications, he had no way to go against the board. Therefore, the director used a reprimanding tone to speak and did not give Jose any face at all. In fact, in this tense situation tonight, the internal disputes of the Nutshell Company had already begun to appear. Zhou raised his umbrella and covered Jose's head. He looked at Sulu with concern. Sulu shook his head, indicating that there was no problem. After Jose calmed down for a moment, he said to this big shot, "This is not a research institute, this is the engineering department. According to the rules of the board of directors, I have the qualifications to approve. If you have any objections to my qualifications, you can raise them at the board meeting, but do not make it difficult for our staff." Sulu is a staff member of the engineering department. He was not in the past, not today, and definitely not in the future. The director said with a serious face, "You have the qualifications to approve, but do not forget that Sulu came into contact with the top-secret MX of the Federation. According to the classification, these approvals are in the company's headquarters. I don't remember when the board of directors gave you the right to make your own decisions." His next sentence directly shattered Jose's thoughts of wanting to protect Sulu. The board of directors has an emergency meeting. We have temporarily stripped your qualifications to approve. All the new staff members who came into contact with MX in the past 2 months will all be brought back for investigation. This is the decision of the board of directors. If you object, please keep it to yourself. This was a very fatal problem. If the board of directors of Nutshell had really made such a decision, then Su Li's access rights would be considered illegal. The other party could investigate him in the name of violating the company's rules and regulations. They could even use the crime of coming into contact with the Federation's confidential data to send him to court. After saying this, the director no longer paid any attention to the silent Jose. He took 2 steps forward and walked into the range of the car's headlight. Looking at Su Lu, he said calmly, "Come with us. You know I won't make things difficult for you. However, during this period of time, you will need to rest somewhere else." Su Lu shook his head. After the incident at Hushan Road, the big shots in the Federation all knew of his relationship with the Tai family. Of course, they would not dare to kill him casually. However, if he resisted, they would be able to find a suitable reason. If he did not resist, they would be able to take him away and forcefully delay the engineering department's mecha development work. He just did not understand why the other party, who was clearly an independent director of Nutshell, would harm the company's interests and stand on the side of those people. "You're just a director of Nutshell. You can't control me." Su Lu took out his ID from his shirt pocket and handed it to the director. He said, "This is my ID. It says on it that I have the authority of the Ministry of National Defense's General Assembly Base. Unless the Minister of National Defense personally gives the order, no one can stop me from entering the engineering department tonight." Chapter 235. In the eyes of many people, Su Lu was just an ordinary guy, at least on the surface. After coming to the capital ring, there were too many outstanding men around him. Whether it was in terms of appearance or inner qualities, they were all much more eye-catching than him. So when he said those words, the director couldn't help but be stunned and began to re-examine him. After taking the ID and looking at it under the headlights of the car, the company's technical director didn't return the ID to Su Lu. He didn't say anything either. Instead, he turned around and walked toward the edge of the crowd. He took out his phone. The Whitewater Company's guards were still holding Su Lu and Bai Yulan in the middle. Without his order, no one dared to let them go. The director took out his encrypted phone and dialed a number. After a while, he asked in a gloomy voice, "Didn't you say that Su Lu and Zhou Yingxing shouldn't be related? That's just a cover. Why does Su Lu have the ID from the Department of Defense?" Secretary Luo's voice came from the other end of the phone. This close subordinate of Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science didn't seem to have expected that Su Lu would take out the special permission from the Department of Defense. He said with some surprise, "According to the analysis of the FBI, Su Lu and the daughter of the Zhou family should be working together. If that's the case, why would the Department of Defense get involved? Could it be the madam's idea?" the director asked in a low voice. He suddenly felt that the August rain was a little cold. "I'm not sure, but Mr. Director, since things have come to this point, we have to continue," Secretary Luo said softly on the other end of the phone. The faint sound of a violin came from the side. The director of the Federation's technical director had a very high status in the Federation. Facing Dean Lin's secretary, he naturally didn't show any fear. He said coldly, "If it's just an internal company matter, of course I can do it. However, this involves the Department of Defense. I don't want to have a conflict with the federal military." After a moment of silence, Secretary Luo said, "Please wait a moment. Dean Lin wants to talk to you." The technical director held the phone and stood under the umbrella. Suddenly, he felt a little unhappy. He turned around and coldly looked at his subordinate. He scolded, "How did you open the umbrella? Can't you see that my shoulders are wet?" The subordinate holding the umbrella panicked slightly and hurriedly extended the umbrella forward, but he didn't dare to say anything. He knew very well that the official he served had already panicked because of the Department of Defense authority that the other party had taken out. An old voice came from the phone. "It's only 4 in the morning. Fortunately, I have the habit of waking up early to play the violin." The technical director cursed in his heart. "Who doesn't know that you usually wake up at 6 o'clock? Today you can't sleep well. Even Secretary Luo is by your side. Naturally, you want to wait for news from me." However, the person on the other end of the line was, after all, a leading figure in the academic world of the Federation of Nations. After pondering for a moment, he said, "Su Lu took out the authority of the Ministry of Defense. I have no choice. I have to leave first." The old voice on the other end of the phone was silent for a moment, then suddenly said in a deep voice, "So what if you have the authority of the Ministry of National Defense? After all, he is still an employee of Nutshell. I don't ask you to bring him in front of me, but I don't want this little soldier to crawl under the Ministry of Engineering again. You know what this means." Hearing the angry voice on the other end of the line, the director's expression became cold. He thought that in the face of material gain, this old guy finally didn't care about the so-called demeanor anymore. He said into the phone, "I'm sorry, but I can't comply. I know that you don't want to be pressured by the military, but you shouldn't overestimate the power of the Tai family." The leader of the academic world of the Federation of Nations on the other end of the line softened his tone and said, "In fact, I don't know how that little guy from the Li family convinced you, but I think that since you stood on his side from the beginning, he must be very willing to let you stand on his side." Hearing the two words Li family, the director's expression became slightly pale. He slowly hung up the phone and walked towards the center of the crowd. In this short distance he thought of a lot of things. He thought of those luxurious nights at the MGM Maystar Casino at the entrance of Bermuda, thought of the 300 million gambling debt he owed, thought of those videotapes. The high and mighty Nutshell director was actually toyed with by such an old-fashioned and despicable method. He couldn't help but mock himself. Only now did he understand that no matter which era it was, money was the most ferocious devil. The most primitive method was often the most frightening method. He was the prisoner who was blinded by the devil's primitive method. Walking in front of Su Lu, the director handed the ID back to Su Lu with a cold face. He had already made a decision. In fact, between losing his reputation and going against the Ministry of Defense, he could only choose the latter. He angrily and irritably knocked away the umbrella that was held by his subordinates behind him. The director stared at Su Li's eyes and said coldly, "Arrest them." The rain soaked the hair of this middle-aged man. Together with his somewhat twisted face, he looked particularly ferocious. When the director made the call, Su Lu thought that the director was verifying the authenticity of the confidential authority of the Ministry of Defense through the phone. However, when the director's expression became so cold and ferocious, he knew that things had changed. He didn't know if it was the Li family or the Federal Academy of Science that found a way to make this independent director of Nutshell disregard the authority of the Ministry of Defense and make such a crazy move. When a person was unreasonable, any rules and principles in the Federation would not work on him. To deal with such a person, one could only be more unreasonable than him. The moment his finger took back the ID, Su Lu was already preparing for this. The director in the rain in front of him was obviously blinded by the previous negotiations and underestimated the determination that Su Lu would show in this incident. He slammed his foot on the ground, and countless splashes shot out like arrows, making the light of the car's headlights appear even dimmer. At this time, layers of rain fell from the sky. There was no lightning or thunder. It was the dark season, and only the light in the rain could help see things. This was the purpose of Su Li's first kick. By Magnolia, who had been holding an umbrella behind him, moved at the same time. This delicate man and Su Lu hadn't known each other for a long time, but the two of them had already formed a very subtle tacit relationship, just like when they were fighting in front of the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. Just as Su Lu raised his leg, Magnolia had already thrown the umbrella in her hand. The black umbrella, which didn't allow light to pass through, fluttered in the wind and rain, and happened to block the headlights of the other car for a moment. The light in the field was slightly disrupted, and shadows moved randomly. Before the guards of the Whitewater Company had time to pull the trigger, the umbrella and the rain of arrows fell softly to the ground at the same time. In such a short period of time, the situation on the battlefield had changed greatly. The director was drenched and his face was pale. His neck was tightly gripped by Su Shou's right hand, and he was dragged to the front of the car. Su Lu used his body to block the aim of the guns. By Magnolia, like a shadow, also came to his side, but didn't look for any obstacles. He just lowered his head slightly, observing the movements of his colleagues in the rain. He didn't have a gun in his hand, only a delicate knife. "Put down your guns," Su Lu said to the surrounding Whitewater Company guards. The guards didn't react at all. In the middle of the encirclement, the two people held the director hostage. In addition to fear, these well-trained mercenaries felt more shame. At this time, it was impossible for them to throw away the guns in their hand. Instead, they held their guns and approached the car inch by inch. The rain hit the metal guns, the hands that held the guns steadily, and everyone's heart. No one knew what would happen in the next moment. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and found that the situation was out of control. He cautiously moved his head to the director's ear and whispered, "This shouldn't be the ending you want. I don't want to kill people, but I don't want to go with you either. Is there any better way?" The paleness on the director's face gradually faded. He said, "This is great. Attacking a senior officer and taking a hostage. Regardless of whether you can clear these charges or not, you can't enter the engineering department again. Of course, if you kill me, your life is over." The rain hit Su Li's face. After a moment of silence, he asked, "What do those people know about you? Do I need to tell you?" The director sneered. The expression on his face was still ferocious, but then he let out a painful groan. Following this miserable groan, the surrounding security personnel stopped in their track. Looking at the scene in front of the car, they revealed a trace of uneasiness. Magnolia stabbed the knife directly into the director's groin. His delicate hand was still holding the slender knife tightly. He lowered his head in the rain and didn't look at the gloomy gun barrels that were close at hand. He said softly, "Everyone here is an expert. You should know that if my hand trembles now, the knife will cut open Mr. Director's aorta. If you can kill me in one shot, when I fall, the tip of the knife will cut open a section of the aorta. When the time comes, the severed blood vessels will shrink into the muscles, and you won't be able to find it no matter how hard you look. I'm rarely so long-winded." Magnolia raised his head and let the rain slide down his face. He looked at the gun barrels around him and said seriously, "I'm worried that there are novices among you who can't see this." The mercenaries of the Whitewater Company were all veterans. The leader of the team waved his arm and stopped his subordinates from advancing. He no longer tried to pressure the two young kidnappers with his aura. He knew that every word Magnolia said was true, and it was obvious that the other party was cold-blooded to the extreme and would not make mistakes like he did. "What are you waiting for?" The director's face was distorted. He reprimanded them loudly, "You are a bunch of trash." There was no one in this world who was not afraid of death, and the respected chief technical director was even more so. However, he did not think that the two kidnappers would dare to kill him, because Su Lu had a strong background and a bright future. Such a person would never do something as unsightly as a life-and-death struggle. The pain in his leg was very real, but this kind of pain made him a little crazy. He angrily scolded the Whitewater guards who did not dare to step forward. At the same time, he turned his head and scolded Su Lu fiercely, "Young man, you're finished. No matter the outcome, just because of this incident, the entire Federation will not tolerate you. At this time, Director Jose had already been pushed aside by the guards. He anxiously shouted to Su Lu across the crowd, "Su Lu, don't do anything stupid." The security work of the engineering department was originally contracted by the Whitewater Company. Although he was the director of the engineering department, he could not command these paramilitary personnel. Moreover, the director was currently in Su Li's hands. That secretary had actually stabbed the director so carelessly. This fact made him feel unprecedented pressure. They knew that Su Lu could not be tied up without a fight, but if he persisted, what if the Whitewater guards really wanted to kill him? He subconsciously wanted Zhou Yu to inform Secretary Shun, regardless of whether it was too late. Who knew that when he turned around, he would find that there was no one beside him. Su Lu did not pay attention to the shouts of these two people. He just narrowed his eyes in the dark rain and watched the movements of the guards. When he saw the index finger of the captain slowly move away from the trigger, he felt slightly relieved. However, at this time, he sharply noticed that one of the guards seemed to have been inadvertently dragged to the periphery. At this moment, he raised the light sniper rifle in his hand and aimed it between Bai Yulan's eyebrows. Bai Yulan also sensitively noticed this. He slightly lowered his head and looked over with cold eyes. If this was in the past, he would definitely rush into the crowd at this time, even if the other party was also a well-trained mercenary. However, at this moment, he could only coldly look at the gunman, because Su Lu was still behind him. A sense of danger surged in Su Li's heart, just like when the Special Task Force agent appeared in Linhai during the New Year. The gunman was probably not one of the director's men. If he opened fire now, it would be a chaotic battle. He was afraid that the director and Su Lu would die on the spot, and the real mastermind behind the scenes would be able to get away scot-free. Thinking of this, he could not do anything, because once he raised his hands and surrendered, all his previous efforts would be in vain. However, the light in his eyes gradually dimmed, as if he had not noticed anything. He thought for a long time, but in reality, in the rainy night, it only took a blink of an eye. The Whitewater Company's guards were still aiming their guns at Su Lu and Bai Yulan, but the gunman outside the crowd had already coldly pulled the trigger. After a muffled sound, a bullet lit up in the rainy night. It slid past the edge of the car's headlights, whistled through the puddles, and shot into the hard ground of the industrial park. Su Lu and Bai Yulan both had time to dodge, but this shot missed. This was because at the moment before the gunman opened fire, a figure used the cover of the rainy night to quietly go behind the gunman from behind. A palm hit the gunman's elbow, interfering with his shooting, and at the same time, a palm strike was viciously aimed at the gunman's neck. The gunman was a very strong character, as he was able to react in such a short time. He turned his head and dodged the palm strike. In the dim rain, he could clearly see that the attacker was the gentle engineer from the engineering department. He did not pay much attention to it, as he was prepared to knock down the engineer and then take advantage of the chaos to escape. The poor gunman did not know that this seemingly gentle engineer was the most outstanding student in this batch of the First Military Academy. Although he was not as meticulous as his predecessors, Shun Li and Shi Qinghai, he still had extremely strong mobility. With a crisp crack, Zhou Yu, whose military uniform was already drenched in sweat, used 3 extremely simple and practical movements to knock the gunman to the ground. He also broke the gunman's upper arm in passing. His attack was extremely ruthless. The moment the gunshot rang out, no one would think about where the gunshot came from. Instead, they would think about who the gunshot had hit. After the well-trained Whitewater Company guards found that no one was hit, they did not go crazy and start firing randomly. However, the situation was complicated, and no one knew what was going on. Those gun barrels could spew out flames at any time. 2 military helicopters flew over at high speed, and the sound of gunshots rang out amidst the flames. In the rain, a deep trench was plowed on the ground by the powerful guns and cannons. "We are Unit 8384 of the Harbor City Garrison District. Everyone, put down your weapons immediately, put down your weapons immediately. Otherwise we will kill without mercy, kill without mercy." From the dark green military helicopter's microphone, a stern voice sounded, as if it was explaining the power of his order. The rotary gun barrels on the aircraft began to rotate at high speed again, making bursts of metal grinding sounds in the rainy night. A deep trench appeared on the hard ground of the industrial park. The high temperature was still maintained in the marks made by the high-speed bullet. The rainwater that fell into the trench sizzled and turned into a faint mist. The debris that was blown away by the powerful firepower of Darren's rotary gun hit the edge of the car, and the metal doors were densely packed with small dots. Although the majority of the Whitewater Company guards were former soldiers of the Federation, their current status was only that of mercenaries. Facing the imposing federal military helicopters, they did not have any intention of resisting. Moreover, the unreasonable gunfire from the cannons had already proved the viciousness of these soldiers. In a situation where they did not have heavy weapons, wanting to face the Federal Army head-on was like a bare-handed person fighting a military mech. In this world, there were not that many Feng Yu and Su Lo. Supervisor Jose stared blankly at the dark green helicopter that landed on the ground, at the Federation soldiers that filed out, and then at the Whitewater Company guards that put down their weapons under Darren's gun barrel. For a moment, he could not help but be stunned. He did not understand what had happened, and why Unit 8384 of the Garrison District would suddenly appear here. An officer walked down from the helicopter, and the rainwater hit his military cap, making patter sound. The officer did not care about the strange gazes around him. Instead, he hurriedly jogged in front of Su Lu, and with a clap, he saluted and said in a deep voice, "Under the orders of the Ministry of National Defense, Unit 8384's Major Lan Xiaolong is here to report to the Chief. We await the Chief's orders." Chapter 236. The rain gradually lessened, but the night wind began to seize the last moments of the summer to travel through the plains and mountains to the south of the port city. With the addition of the wind stirred up by the two helicopters, it appeared to be a bit stronger. It swept up slightly moist water droplets and slapped onto people's faces, making them wet and cold. In the wind and rain, Su Lu heard someone call him Chief for the first time. He couldn't help but be stunned. He thought to himself that he was only a captain, but this officer was a colonel. How exactly were these ranks divided? On the side, Manager Jose had long been shocked by these soldiers of the Federation. Although he had a lot of dealings with the military, when he saw two combat helicopters and a large group of fully armed soldiers brazenly entering the industrial park just for Su Lu, he naturally had more thoughts in his mind. The major named Lan Xiaolong saluted Su Lu. After receiving his response, he took a step to the left and looked at the director, who was half leaning on the front of the car with a serious expression. He said in a deep voice, "Because you are suspected of interfering with the confidential affairs of the Federal Army and intending to murder an active duty officer, this, sir, you may need to be investigated." Not long after, the charge that the director had assigned to Su Lu was returned to him by this officer. The things in the world were always so wonderful. The director endured the intense pain at the base of his leg and looked coldly at the major in front of him. He said, "You are just a little major, and you dare to be so presumptuous." The major saluted with a bang and said, "Sir, the major is not a little major, but he is not presumptuous. I am only asking you to cooperate with the investigation according to the orders of the superior. Of course, we believe that as the most loyal partner of the federal military, the respected board member of the Nutshell Company will definitely not be a criminal." The major suddenly changed the topic and said with a smile, but you are injured now. How about we use the helicopter to send you to the police hospital for treatment? At first, he was serious and upright, then he lowered his body and teased, politely with a hint of banter. Sulu and Mr. Jose looked at this officer and couldn't help but be stunned. When the truck was stopped at the checkpoint earlier, Sulu had informed Secretary Jiao. However, he did not expect that it would take such a short time for the Ministry of Defense to send someone over. Moreover, the person who came was an officer that he could not see through. A member of the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company was a big shot. Even if he was facing a powerful military force, he would not be afraid. Therefore, the way this major handled the situation was very appropriate. Bai Yulan had been keeping her head down the entire time. When she heard this, she casually pulled out a small knife. Mr. Director groaned in pain. He felt a burst of coldness at the base of his leg. He thought that his artery had been cut. He was scared out of his wits. His legs went soft and he wanted to fall to the ground. But he was supported by two soldiers, one on the left and one on the right. Major Lan Xiaolong squatted down and checked his injury. He comforted him and said, "Don't worry, it is only a flesh wound." When the knife was pulled out, it did not even shake. Under the supervision of the Federal Army, the whitewater soldiers wearing black rain protection combat suits scattered in all directions. There was not much worry on their faces. After all, in terms of bone structure, they were all members of the same system. Tonight's conflict was just a competition between the big shots of the Federation. After they were arrested and sent to the police station, they would not be too miserable. With the help of the soldiers, the pale-faced Mr. Director boarded the helicopter and left in a sorry state. All that was left was the rain, the dim lights, and the deep trench that was blasted by the machine gun. Because of the brazen intervention of the Federal Army, the operation specifically targeting Sulu collapsed. Whether it was the 7 major families or the Federal Academy of Science, in the face of the participation of the military, they had to choose to retreat. Presumably, at the beginning, those big shots would not have thought that the Federal Army, which had many internal factions, would actually unite for a person like Sulu. They would not hesitate to shed all pretense of cordiality with them. In the end, it was these big shots from the secular world who did not understand the iron will of the Federal Army and the strong desire to win the war for the Empire. The only pity was that the assassin that was subdued by Zhou Yu still chewed up the poison pill buried deep in the mucous membranes of his mouth, even though he had lost an arm. This kind of extreme method of burying poison, even Zhou Yu, who had received professional training, was not able to discover it in the first moment. No assassin is willing to die. He must have a backup plan. Under the pursuit of charter, his only backup plan is to leave the Federation and go as far as Bermuda. Zhou Yu took off his wet clothes and said to Sulu, "In order to escape the pursuit of the Federation as quickly as possible, this assassin's backup plan could only be at the spaceport in Harbor City." Sulu immediately understood Zhou Yu's meaning. He turned his head and whispered a few words to Major Lan Xiaolong. The other party called him Chief. He did not know if the other party was joking or not, but he did not really think that he could order the other party to do things. Lan Xiaolong nodded with a serious expression and reported this information to the relevant departments in the garrison. After the phone call, his eyes fell on Magnolia Bai, who was beside Sulu. That delicate man made him feel a little complicated. After taking a hot shower, Sulu put all his busy and nervous feelings behind him. In the underground office of the engineering department, he dialed Secretary Jiao's number. After waiting for a while, a calm and tired voice came from the other end of the phone. Unit 8384 has not been on the front line for many years, but their combat strength is not bad. From now on, until the MX is successfully developed, they will be responsible for your safety. Sulu held the phone and nodded. Facing the eyes of the aristocratic families and the politicians, as well as the power and dark methods, he was indeed a little tired. Being able to obtain the protection of the Federal Army was naturally the best way. He did not have to worry about his own safety anymore. However, he heard something else from the voice of this big boss of the Department of Defense. Deputy Minister Zhou seemed to be under a great deal of pressure. "I will raise this matter to the higher-ups during the joint conference," Deputy Minister Zhou said over the phone. Su Lu nodded. He knew in his heart that the higher-ups of the Joint Conference of Staff were naturally President Sig. Mr. President asked the office staff to knock on the Joint Conference of Staff. Naturally, the Joint Conference of Staff would not dare to do anything. Immediately after, he somewhat understood where Deputy Minister Zhou's pressure came from. Mobilizing the garrison forces was definitely not something that the Deputy Minister of Defense could decide alone. However, the obvious bias shown in this matter could make people think that he was too close to the Tai family. This was definitely not in line with the political ethics of a cabinet member of the Federation government. Last time, I said that the Federation only needs the MX to be developed. The other end of the phone was silent for a moment. Zhou Yingxing said in a cold and serious tone, "But now I hope that the first to succeed is the engineering department, or rather you." Chapter 237. Hee was a very interesting and insightful laughter. It originated from Wang Dong and became famous from Instructor Zhang's mouth. I liked Zhang Lu's commentary the most, especially when he was paired with Ah Huang. Every weekend, I would only hear the two of them laughing obscenely. It was great. Now, Instructor Zhang had the voice but not the form. Without sarcasm in crosstalk, what kind of art would it be? I had also been, these 2 days because I was really proud. Especially now that the work was completed, the feeling of pride was even stronger. I couldn't help but chuckle a few more times. I was so proud of myself that I said I was going to explode. In these 7 days, I wrote 75,000 words. If I don't compare myself to other awesome people, just looking at my career of making up stories to entertain everyone, this is really the first time. I have never worked so hard before. Moreover, my effort was so beautiful that it went straight to the point where my nature was playful. I was proud of everyone. I had asked for votes in the last 2 hours, but I still managed to get so many votes. I had always been a narcissist, especially after 7 days. I thought that I was a hard-working and hidden talent. However, I didn't expect that everyone was the one who had truly hidden their talent. You were indeed better than me. If there were no accidents, I should be 4th this month. I was very satisfied. Thank you everyone. Compared to last month's 4th, I felt much more comfortable and at ease. That was because last month's work was really bad and the writing was average. Alright, this was the 3rd reason why I was so proud of myself. This month, it was more of one thing. The key was that I seemed to have found the rhythm of writing this kind of story, just like how Su Lu was trying to capture the rhythm of the Magnolia. The later parts of the story would occasionally stagnate, but that was basically because my brain was blocked. Most of the time, the story of the spy began to move forward, and I was very pleased with this. At the beginning of the month, I had promised everyone that I would write 200,000 words this month. Wait a minute, I had to count the words. When I came back, I had written about 230,000 words. I thought it would be a lot more. I was about to say that I had exceeded the quota, but it seems that I had to say that I had perfectly completed the task. The reason for the 7 days of exploding was actually mentioned in the announcement. The main reason was that I was relatively free at the end of the month, so I had time to play. Next month, I would be too busy. Well, that was the main point. Next month, I would be really busy. There were too many things for a family man to do. Moreover, I was in a foreign land. Everyone knew that only my leader and I had to work hard. There were many things that we had to do by ourselves. We couldn't ask for help, so I was busy and busy. I would like to formally inform everyone that my goal for September is to get 150,000 words. Promise to keep updating, but I really didn't have time. Chapter 238. These last words of Deputy Minister Zhou finally revealed a sliver of the pressure he was under. However, this enormous pressure was successfully transferred onto Su Lu through these words. After he put down the phone, he was silent for a long time before resuming his work at the Nutshell Engineering Department. The Federation's new generation MX mecha development had always been carried out by the Nutshell Engineering Department alone. However, after the failure, the Federal Academy of Science had quickly discovered an opportunity in this matter. After seizing Professor Shun's core data, the Mecha Development Department had long since been naturally divided into two factions. The competition between the two sides would also indirectly affect the Federation's presidential election. No matter which side it was a bargaining chip that could not be given up. The competition between the two sides had actually always been hidden under the surface. It was only because of the variable known as Su Lu that the Academy of Science had felt anxious. That was why there had been that conflict on that rainy night, bringing this competition to the surface. In that conflict, the Port City Garrison Unit 8384 had officially taken over the security work of the Nutshell Engineering Department under the orders of the Department of National Defense. After this incident, the two sides had officially shed all pretense of cordiality. Su Lu knew that his role in the development of MX was no longer a secret. However, now that he had so many Federation soldiers protecting him, while he felt slightly restricted, he also felt much more relaxed. With the federal military, or at least a portion of the military's strength, standing behind him, this sense of security was something he would never have imagined in the past. The military was loyal to the President and the Federation. Countless years of history and the monitoring of the Constitution could guarantee that this loyalty would never be mixed with anything else. However, it was still a large and privileged system, so the internal structure was still divided according to the divisions of the various military regions or the combat forces during the Great War years, divided into several large factions. Among these military factions, the most special and transcendent was naturally the Federation space warship fleet led by that three-star female general. 4 groups of warships patrolled the peaceful stars of the universe, independent and natural. In addition, the federal military had 4 major military regions. Among them, the most advanced and powerful was naturally the 1st military region stationed on planet S1, and the 4th military region, which was perennially in a state of confrontation with the Empire. Every time he thought of the Federation's military deployment as an orphan of Donglin, Su Li's heart would surge with complicated emotions. The Donglin region was also a part of the Federation, but there was only one garrison on Donglin, a barren resource system. There was also no terrifying external enemy like the Empire, so it was no wonder the Federation did not value Donglin. Was always by Su Li's side, an armored combat battalion led by Major Lan Xiaolong, belonging to Unit 8384. Unit 8384 was actually the 17 independent land-based armored division of the 1st Military Region. It was an ace division with a glorious tradition. Its position in the federal military was special because the god of war, Li Pifu, once came from this division. He once led this armored division in the war with the Empire, creating one legend after another. Many years ago, Li Pifu left the 17 Armored Division and rose to become the commander of the federal military. After finally living in seclusion, the Department of Defense and the 1st Military Region headquarters were endlessly distressed about how to arrange the 17 Armored Division. The political requirements of the Federation were destined to not let this legend be destroyed, just like how no one dared to let the god of war, Li Pifu, a statue-level figure, fail even once. Therefore, the 17th Armored Division was withdrawn from the front line of the West Woods to Planet S1 and became the main military force in the most prosperous city garrison of the Federation, Unit 8384. Since they wanted an undefeated legend, if they didn't let this division go to war, naturally, they would never be defeated. Because of this secret meaning that couldn't be said out loud, the 17th Armored Division didn't participate in a real battle for many years. Even when the federal military arranged for the various military regions to take turns to fight on the front line of the West Woods, they didn't have a part to play in it. Until one time, when the god of war expressed his concern about the combat strength of the old division in his hometown in Philadelphia. Then, like a little wife, his disciples took some combat personnel below platoon level from the 17th Armored Division and sent them to Bermuda as a show of respect to the god of war. The Ace Armored Division had become a decoration because of political needs. Based in the place for a long time, interacting with society, and being influenced by the lights, the iron-blooded troops gradually became silent and mediocre in the most prosperous area of the Federation. Just like the number of their garrison, they became a little more like 8384. Although there are a lot of mountains in the military, places like the 1st Military Region are all silent places for the senior generals because the 1st Military Region is always shrouded in the glory of the god of war. When Zhou Yu mentioned that name, his expression became a little serious. It seemed that if he didn't do so, he couldn't express the respect a professional soldier had for the god of war. I heard that the Li family has some influence in the 1st Military Region. After all, they are a family with a long history, and they have been sparing no effort to sponsor the living area of the military region. It seems like they don't care about the cost and just want to get some benefit. But you don't have to worry about anything. After all, the Li family is not the Zhong family. No matter how big their influence on the military is, it's limited. This was already something that happened a few days later. Su Lu was asking Zhou Yu about the complicated factions in the military. There was no less gossip and secret information in the military than in society. Zhou Yu, who was respected by his classmates and loved by his teachers in the 1st Military Academy, had a very clear understanding of the factions in the military. His fingers left the workbench, and he rubbed his temples tiredly. He leaned back in his chair and listened to Zhou Yu's explanation. However, his eyes drifted to the corner of the warehouse. In the past few days, he had already noticed that the major called Lan Xiaolong should know Bai Yulan. Because he forgot that Secretary Bai had once mentioned that he was from the 17th Armored Division, he didn't quite understand. In that corner, Major Lan Xiaolong was squatting on the ground and smoking. He was whispering something to Bai Yulan beside him. Bai Yulan still had a calm and gentle appearance. She crossed her arms, leaned against the wall, and lowered her head slightly. After a long time, she would reply softly, "That matter has already faded. Do you want me to go talk to the division commander and transfer you back from Whitewater?" Lan Xiaolong squatted on the ground and said, "The money in the military will definitely not be as much as you are now, but you will still have a status, and it will be much more stable." Bai Yulan looked at the tips of her shining boots and said softly, "You are already a major. Should I go back and start as a soldier? I got my position as a major through flattery. Why did I rush over with 2 helicopters this time? I know that this is a relationship between the big shots in the Federation, but I still have to take the risk. Also, that vice minister might really become a major next year. Why should I be afraid of taking a risk?" Lan Xiaolong nagged, "You are much more capable than me. When I was a company commander in the recruit camp, you could eat me alive. Go back to the 17th Armored Division and work hard for 2 years. Then the division commander will transfer you to his side and train you. Being a major is nothing." Unit 8384. Bai Yulan softly repeated the unit number of her old unit. She laughed at herself and said softly, "I am not from the 17th Armored Division anymore. Life in Hong Kong is too easy. You are invited to those clubs every day. I am not used to this kind of life. I also like to enjoy myself, but I don't want to do this kind of thing in uniform. I wear plain clothes every time I go there. Lan Xiaolong said angrily. Bai Yulan lowered her head, smiled and said, but I still don't have the face to go back. The Department of National Defense only let my division go after the war god gave the order. I went with the first batch, but I was the only one who came back alive. I made the 17th Division lose all its face. From then on, the military never even mentioned the matter of taking turns to battle. From this point of view, I also made the war god lose face once. Don't talk nonsense. The war god is fishing in Philadelphia. How would he know a small fish like you? Lan Xiaolong scolded in a low voice. You are just too unlucky. The Department of National Defense sent us to the edge of Bermuda for safety reasons. We thought that nothing would happen, so we were demoted to one of your classes. Who would have thought that we would meet the Empire's special bastard battalion on that godforsaken mining planet? A class against a battalion. Even if the Empire's mech pilots are really bastards, the only outcome would be complete annihilation. It's already very impressive of you to be able to escape and come back. Otherwise, with the teacher's temper, he would have executed you long ago. Why would he speak for you in the military court? Hearing the war god's name repeatedly, Bai Yulan lowered her eyes. She naturally thought of the time when she first joined the army. She was still a teenager. Her quiet and clever personality was noticed by the war god, so she was transferred to the war god's side as a messenger. After that, she made a name for herself in the 17th Armored Division. But, she raised her head and looked at Su Lu, who was silently working at the workbench. She said softly, I still can't go back. My life is not my own now. Lan Xiaolong followed her gaze and knew what Bai Yulan was talking about. He couldn't help but frown. He was now in charge of protecting that ordinary-looking technical supervisor. He really couldn't see anything special about that person. He also couldn't understand why Bai Yulan was always by that person's side. I sold my life to him for 20 million, Bai Yulan said with a smile. Lan Xiaolong was stunned. Then, he cursed under his breath. However, this soldier found that Bai Yulan seemed to be more talkative and more cheerful than a few years ago. He couldn't help but think, could it be because of that young man? Thinking of this, his impression of Su Lu improved a lot. Just as the engineering department was abnormally busy, and Bai Yulan and Lan Xiaolong were catching up with each other, Manager Jose hurriedly walked into this spacious underground warehouse. His footsteps were heavy, and the expression on his face was even heavier. Watch the news, he said to Su Lu. There was a trace of worry in his eyes. Su Lu was slightly stunned. He could vaguely guess what had happened. The workbench connected to the engineering department's network couldn't go online. He took out his phone and switched to the Federation's news channel. He saw the male anchor on the screen saying in an excited tone, regarding the birth of this revolutionary mecha, how significant its military significance to the Federation, we would like to ask Professor Zhang of the Institute of Mechanical Engineering at the Academy of Sciences. Su Lu immediately logged onto the real-time news platform of the online newspaper. He saw a very eye-catching headline appear on the front page of the Capital Special District Daily. The Federal Academy of Science officially announces that the new generation of twin-engine MX mecha has been successfully developed. Chapter 239. The atmosphere in the underground storeroom suddenly became stifling. Bai Yulan walked behind Su Lu and lowered her head to look at the contents of the news. Zhou Yu's brows also furrowed. Jose sighed and brought up the news screen. Su Li's gaze moved away from the phone and landed on the news screen again. His eyes narrowed and he remained silent. Everyone watched the news screen in silence. The scrolling news of the Federation was currently replaying the news conference held by the Federal Academy of Science today. In front of the dark blue background of the stage, the leader of the Federation's academic community, Dean Lin, was currently waving his arms and vigorously explaining something. Following his explanation, the 3D light screen behind him began to change. A light purple mecha gradually condensed within the light, revealing its intimidating and elegant figure. The 3D light screen changed again, and the new light purple mecha broke down into countless parts, floating in the air above the hall, revealing its advanced design concept. In particular, the streamlined twin engines floating in the middle attracted everyone's attention. Countless cameras in the press conference were focused on the stage. The reporters were so shocked that they couldn't ask any questions. They all vaguely knew that the Federation was researching this revolutionary new mecha, but they didn't know that the Academy of Science had actually quietly succeeded in developing it. They knew better than the average citizen what kind of glory this new dual-engine mecha would bring to the Federation. This is a new era, an era that belongs to MX. Dean Lin placed both hands on the stage and used an extremely dignified gaze to calmly scan the surroundings as he spoke slowly. As his voice fell, the parts of the new mecha scattered around the 3D light screen began to gather towards the center. Accompanied by the beautiful sound of metal assembling, the new light purple MX was reassembled, emitting a faint glow. At the same time, the blue background suddenly turned into a soft existence like flowing water, pouring down like mercury. A realistic purple streamlined MX mecha appeared in front of everyone's eyes, gradually merging with the mecha in the three-dimensional light beam image. Then, the light beam dissipated, leaving behind the new mecha that was 7 meters tall, looking coldly and proudly at everyone at the press conference. The rolling news had ended, and the warehouse of the Shell Engineering Department was still silent. A depressing atmosphere hung over everyone's head. Supervisor Jose's face was pale, and Su Lu lowered his head. Zhou Yu clenched his fists tightly. Secretary Bai tilted her head to look at him. Only Major Lan Xiaolong did not understand why these people seemed so dejected. The white MX mech that was fixed to the wall of the quarantine zone had yet to be assembled. Its 3 thick and heavy mechanical arms were slowly adjusting. The body of the white mech was slightly tilted to one side, as if it was watching the news in a daze. Even it did not understand why that purple goblin on the screen had been born before it. No one knew better than the people present what the Federal Academy of Sciences' announcement of the successful development of the MX mech represented. This meant that the Shell Motor Company's 10 years of hard work had all become a wedding dress for the Federal Academy of Science. This meant that the hard work of countless engineers had all been for naught. For Su Lu, this meant even more. For example, Professor Shen, the presidential election, shameless people. Bai Yulan, who was standing behind him, looked at his dejected back with a complicated expression. Suddenly, she whispered a few words to Zhou Yu. Zhou Yu shook his head. The information of the engineering department had been leaked. This had already been determined after the arrest of the board of directors. However, the most suspicious person, Supervisor Hao, had already been transferred away before the incident. From a certain perspective, this senior supervisor's actions were equivalent to betraying the Tai family and also betraying the Nutshell Engineering Department. However, this senior supervisor also had his own background. If this was really his doing, then he had now climbed up another big tree. The Federation was a place where rules were followed. The Tai family could not just drag out that supervisor and kill him. There were also no leads on the spaceship that the gunman had escaped from. Therefore, the crux of the matter now was the speed of the development of the MX mech. The Nutshell Engineering Department and Su Lu had allowed for failure, but the Academy of Science had rushed to announce the success first. Su Lu thought of the pressure Deputy Minister Zhou had displayed on the phone and those words he had said. He knew that he could not lose. He lowered his head and rubbed his disheveled hair. Both his feet were on the chair, but he did not express any opinion. At the same time, in the nutshell engineering department not far from this backup storage, the atmosphere had also become extremely strange. More than 200 of the company's top engineers were silently looking at the large holographic screen on the ceiling. They were looking at the scene of the Federal Academy of Sciences press conference. A feeling of disappointment and defeat pervaded the air. A very long time passed, but still no one spoke. The work that had been busy for many days also came to a temporary halt. Only a female engineer wearing cute round glasses stood up with curiosity. She stared at the beautiful yet murderous light purple mecha on the news screen. She compared it with the blueprint of the MX mecha on her workbench and found some differences. From these differences she felt that there was something strange. Supervisor Jose knew very well that the reason Sulu was willing to cooperate with the engineering department was because this young man had a certain stubbornness. He did not want Professor Shin's research results to be maliciously stolen by those academic bureaucrats. He also knew how much effort Sulu had put in for this new mecha. Many sleepless days and nights had all been spent on this matter. Looking at that somewhat dejected back, he could not help but be a little worried. Would this young prodigy find it difficult to accept this result? However, right now, his mood was also unusually cold. Even if he wanted to comfort the other, he could not find any words. Just as everyone thought that Sulu was about to break down, he slowly raised his head and turned to look at the crowd with a smile. It was not a bitter smile, but rather a smile like the radiant sun. His eyes were narrowed like two beautiful moons in the night sky, and his pearly white teeth were exposed outside his lips, as clean as the snow in Linhai. What are you all standing around for? The Federal Academy of Science is a top academic institution. Do you all think that because their technical reserves are weaker than ours, they should naturally fall behind us? Sulu stood up, stretched, and said with a smile, "They've already announced success, so we can't just stand around. We need to hurry up and finish what we have on hand." This overly normal reaction made everyone feel that Sulu had become somewhat abnormal under this kind of shock. Manager Jose laughed bitterly and said in a hoarse voice, "You also know that their level is higher. They've gotten ahead of us, so what we're doing is already meaningless. You should know that there can only be one standard for the new generation of mecha." In that instant when he had lowered his head, Sulu had thought of many things. He had always felt that something was not right about this matter. He had a mature design plan personally guided by Professor Shin, and he himself had long since stopped deliberately slowing down the engineering department's research speed. Even if the data was leaked, the Academy of Science could not possibly be faster than the engineering department. On that rainy night, the other party's last attempt to stop the development of the nutshell engineering department had failed. Furthermore, if Manager Hao had really leaked part of the engineering department's progress and data, the Academy of Science would definitely feel unprecedented pressure. Pressure could sometimes be motivation, but it could also make the person in charge feel anxious and flustered, just like Manager Jose was right now. Sulu was increasingly certain that the Federal Academy of Science must not have completed sufficient internal testing. As such, the possibility of the other party discovering that he had tampered with the core data was even lower. Thus, he was not flustered. In fact, he was even somewhat glad about the events of that rainy night and Manager Hao's leak. If not for that, he really did not have the confidence that he would be able to use those fake data to fool the other party. This is a one-sided press conference by the Academy of Science. The Federation government might not even know about it. Perhaps that Dean Lin wants to create an established fact, but the problem is that we're almost there too. How could the government not consider our side? He smiled and said to everyone, "This press conference was very well done, but I keep having this feeling that the bigger their momentum now, the more embarrassing it will be in the future." No one understood this sentence, But looking at Su Li's smiling face, for some reason, they suddenly felt a little more confident. In the small conference room on the top floor of the Ministry of National Defense building in the capital's Special Administrative Region, a voice rang out. The owner of the voice was President Sieg's scientific advisor. He looked at the big shots around the round table, frowned, and said, "What exactly is the Academy of Science doing? Even Mr. President does not know about this matter, and they just held a press conference. If in the future the experiment fails again like last autumn, who will explain it to the people of the Federation? How will the Empire view us?" This scientific advisor had a good relationship with Zhou Yingxing. They had once attended Professor Shen's funeral together. For him to say something like this now naturally represented the attitude of a certain side. However, sitting in the very middle of the room, the National Security Advisor said disapprovingly, "Since the Academy of Science dared to hold a press conference, they naturally have confidence. As for the testing aspect, with the lesson of the nutshell incident, they will definitely be much more careful." Zhou Yingxing sat quietly in a corner of the round table. Such a meeting of the highest level of the Federation was usually held in the President's official residence, but today, because of the matter of the new MX mecha, it had been moved to the Ministry of National Defense. As the Deputy Minister of National Defense, he was not considered a key figure in such an occasion. In the past, he had rarely spoken, but today, for some reason, he looked at the document in his hands and reminded everyone in a low voice, "The Engineering Department's research is also nearing completion." The National Security Advisor rudely interrupted him and said sharply, "How much of the Federation's funds has the Engineering Department wasted in these past 10 years? In the end, all they made last year was a piece of trash that could explode. So what if their research is successful this time? Could it be that the Federation's new generation of mecha coexists with two standards? Then in the future, which standard will be used to equip the troops?" At this time, President Sieg was still inspecting South Kazhou. The person with the highest status in this meeting was naturally the National Security Advisor. This important figure's clear stance and faint dissatisfaction in his words made all the officials in the meeting think that Zhou Yingxing would be as silent as before. However, right at this time, the usually low-key Deputy Minister Zhou took off his glasses and threw them onto the table. Meeting the gaze of the National Security Advisor, he said coldly, "Of course, we'll use whichever standard is better." Chapter 240. The glasses fell on the smooth table and made a soft sound. It was a little harsh. Zhou Yingxing's cold retort at this time made everyone feel even more surprised. The most powerful political figures in the Federation were sitting in the small conference room, so naturally, they would not show this kind of surprise on their faces. They continued to look at the documents with their heads down as before, drinking tea as if they had not heard anything. However, they were all shocked and confused. They did not understand why Zhou Yingxing would jump out of his silence and confront the National Security Advisor directly. The National Security Advisor's expression was somewhat ugly. After a moment, he said calmly, "So we have to wait for Nutshell? The question is, how long do you have to wait? How long does the Federation have to wait? 3 months? Half a year? We can wait, but will those ambitious people in the Empire wait? Everyone here should be aware that the Empire's new mecha had already been in development since 3 years ago. Although we still don't know how far they have progressed, we have to make our own preparations. If the MX is equipped to the front lines a day earlier, the Federation's brave soldiers may have one less sacrifice. I disagree with Deputy Minister Zhou's opinion. We shouldn't have to wait for too long." Zhou Yingxing calmly looked at the documents in front of him and said, "But if we don't wait and unilaterally adopt the new mecha standards of the Academy of Science, how will we appease Nutshell? As far as I know, there are hundreds of engineers and tens of thousands of workers in the engineering department who have put in years of hard work for this mecha. How long is not too long? The National Security Advisor looked coldly at Zhou Yingxing and said, "As the President's National Security Advisor, I cannot disregard the safety of the Federation just to appease the employees of one company." The atmosphere in the conference room had long become somewhat tense. It was not common to see the Deputy Minister of Defense face to face with the National Security Advisor, so most people chose to remain silent. Even the scientific advisor, who was secretly on Zhou Yingxing's side, could not confirm how long Nutshell would take, so it was not convenient for him to offer his support. "I think the Nutshell should stop for now." Mr. Security Consultant looked into Zhou Yingxing's eyes and said firmly. At this moment, an official who had been sitting at the corner of the round table suddenly smiled at the crowd and said, "I think we can wait for 2 more days." The people in the meeting room naturally knew that this young official was the Deputy Director of the Office of the President's Residence, Boog. As the Deputy Director of the Office of the President's Residence, his level of authority was not high, but because of his relationship with the President, he was able to attend the meeting. Could it be that he was speaking on behalf of the President? In a moment of doubt and silence, Deputy Director Boog looked at the security consultant and said politely, "The key is time. It's not appropriate to wait too long." He then turned to Zhou Yingxing and asked calmly, "The Department of National Defense should be monitoring the progress of the Shell Engineering Department. Can you give me a specific time?" After a moment of silence, Zhou Yingxing said, "1 week." A joint meeting that appeared to be tit-for-tat on the surface, but which was surging in the dark, thus ended. The Federation government still had not made any specific follow-up measures in response to the explosive news from the Academy of Science. Just outside the meeting room, the security consultant dialed the President's top-secret phone number. As he silently cursed this useless idiot far away in South Dakota, his facial expression and tone simultaneously changed. Khufu. The security consultant had an extremely close relationship with President Sieg, so he directly called out the President's name. Moreover, there was a trace of friendly concern in his warm tone. "Regarding the matter of the new Mecca, what exactly do you think?" President Sieg's angry voice came from the other end of the phone. "The Academy of Science actually released the news without informing the government. Does that Lin fellow still have any respect for me, the President?" The security consultant softly comforted him, and said a few words on behalf of the Federal Academy of Science. Only then did the President's anger dissipate slightly. After hanging up the phone, he touched his silver hair, and could not help but shake his head. He thought to himself that this friend and student of his was really an idiot. If he had not taken care of many things for him these past few years, he was afraid that he really would have become the most laughable president in the history of the Federation. After Zhou Yingxing left the meeting room, he directly went to his office. Secretary Jiao, who had been following behind him, quickly dialed the number of the Shell Engineering Department in Hong Kong and found Su Lu. "You only have 1 week," Liao said. Secretary Jiao thought of the tired state of the President and said in a more serious tone, "The minister has already done his best." In a manor on the outskirts of the capital of Nank State, Special Task Force agents dressed in dark suits were vigilantly watching everything that was happening outside the manor. In a room on one side of the manor, a device specifically used to monitor the electrical current noise caused by the heating of large-scale equipment was constantly working. Ever since the assassination attempt at the Linhai State Gymnasium, the big shots of the Federation realized that there were actually people in this world who were crazy enough to use military mechas to carry out assassinations. This manor was the summer retreat of the President of the Federation, so in terms of security and defense, they were naturally very cautious. Beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the manor, President Huff Sieg was looking at the scenery outside with a gloomy face. There was no trace of the anger that he had shown in the previous phone call. Some people are really messing around. The Federal Academy of Science is in a mess, and Senil is also in a mess now. The highest leader of the Federation was known for his two opposite personalities, which were cowardice and anger. He had never been highly regarded in the political world, and his popularity was also very low. However, for some reason, he had already been re-elected once. The director of the office stood silently behind the president with the phone in his hand. Senil was the national security advisor, the president's teacher in school, a friend, and an important figure in the government. There was no doubt that President Hufsieg's words clearly expressed his dissatisfaction with this person. There are still a few months before my term ends, but some people are already in a hurry to find their next job. President Hufsieg's lips curled into a mocking smile as he said, when Senator Pabre was still a lawyer, he had already embarrassed Senil several times. His company was awarded a large sum of money. No wonder he is so nervous this time. The director of the office stood behind the president and said, "There is still a week for the shell." A week. That should be enough to satisfy that, madam. President Hufsieg lit a thick stick of tobacco and said vaguely, "I don't care who wins or loses. As long as it's beneficial to the Federation, it's fine. Internal conflicts can't mess up external affairs. I've been resting for the Federation for 10 years just to prepare for the upcoming invasion of the Empire." No. The president waved the tobacco in his hand. "My successor should have the courage to attack the Empire." The entire Federation was passionately discussing the new generation of the MX Mecha in the past few days. There were continuous in-depth reports on the TV and newspapers. The researchers of the Federal Academy of Science suddenly became the most popular interview guests. For the sake of confidentiality, they naturally wouldn't discuss the specific technical parameters and development process of the light purple MX Mecha. However, the possible effects of the dual engines had been thoroughly analyzed. In addition to the TV and newspapers, the various forums and microblogs on the internet also played an important role in this mecha craze. Countless military enthusiasts of the Federation spared no effort in analyzing the combat performance of the MX Mecha through the limited video data available. Countless people fantasized about the brave soldiers of the Federation operating the powerful mecha and defeating the barbaric invaders in the war against the Empire's invasion. In the blink of an eye, the patriotic passion of the Federation was fully aroused. Everyone was discussing the mecha, the dual engines, the electron jet, and other technical terms that they didn't understand before. Following this discussion, the Federal Academy of Sciences' position in the hearts of the people became more and more noble. Dean Lin, who led the development of the new mecha, also received unprecedented respect. In this atmosphere, even the most important autumn offensive of the presidential election was about to be forgotten by the media and the people. Only a very small number of people knew that the public support that the Federal Academy of Science gained from this incident was about to be converted into political support for the election of Ross Medellin's presidential candidate partner. On the surface, the underground nutshell engineering department of the Harbor City Industrial Park wasn't affected by this craze. All the engineers continued to follow the established schedule, silently and diligently carrying out their work. Life had to go on. Although that faint sense of disappointment still shrouded the space, as long as the Federation government didn't announce it, they would fight for it. The MX Mecha parked in the underground warehouse was nearing completion. In the isolation room, on the assembly line, countless components were being assembled. The wings were attached, and the firepower system was also beginning to be installed one by one on the body of the mecha under the fine control of the mechanical arms. After the second coating, the surface of the MX mecha glowed with a silvery white light. Coupled with the wings on the back, it looked exceptionally beautiful. Beautiful, but it could be forgotten by the entire Federation. Sulu rubbed his dry eyes and licked his dry lip. He looked at the MX mecha in front of him with more confidence than anyone else. It was at this moment that two words suddenly appeared on the gray holographic screen of the workbench. "Hello." Sulu was slightly taken aback. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the two small words. Shock grew in his heart. This was the workbench that he had spent a great deal of effort to set up. It could block all wireless communications. How could someone hack into the workbench and send him a signal? Could it be that existence he didn't want to think of again, and wanted to chat with him out of boredom? The intruder didn't frighten Su Lu for too long. A second line of small words immediately appeared. I've done a comparison of the component. I feel that some of the designs of the mecha from the Academy of Science are better. Would you like to take a look? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.